The map did not bleed. That was the strange mercy of Verdun. No city burned in that room. No king was dragged from his throne. No cathedral roof collapsed under fire. There was only parchment, ink, noblemen, clerics, messengers, and the quiet violence of measurement. Rivers traced by hand, borders argued over, lands assigned like portions of an inheritance too large for any family to hold without tearing itself apart. August 843. The empire of Charlemagne was being divided by his grandsons, not by pagans from the forests, not by Muslim armies from across the mountains, not by Lombards, Saxons, Avars, or any of the enemies Charlemagne had spent his life defeating. By his own blood, somewhere behind the political language of peace, behind the solemnity of oaths and negotiated settlement, the old imperial dream was being reduced into three great pieces. West Francia for Charles the Bold, East Francia for Louis the German, the long, uneasy Middle Kingdom for Lothar, who kept the imperial title but could no longer make that title command obedience from the whole inheritance. It was not called France yet. It was not called Germany yet. But something had begun. A wound had been drawn across the map of Europe, and later centuries would keep reopening it. The men who stood around that settlement were not merely dividing land. They were admitting what civil war had already proven. The empire that Charlemagne built could be conquered by one extraordinary ruler, but it could not be inherited whole by ordinary heirs trapped inside an extraordinary system. And that is where the tragedy begins, not with ruins, with a settlement, with men trying to stop the bloodshed and discovering that peace itself required the empire to be cut apart. Before Verdun, there had been Fontenoy. In 841, 2 years before the treaty, Frankish warriors had faced other Frankish warriors on a field near Fontenoy-en-Puisaye. This was not a frontier battle. It was not an imperial campaign against an outside enemy. It was family politics turned into mud, iron, horses, screams, and bodies. On one side stood Lothar, the eldest surviving son of Louis the Pious, claiming the authority of emperor. Against him stood his brothers, Charles the Bold and Louis the German, allied not because they shared some grand vision of Europe, but because both understood that if Lothar's imperial supremacy became real, their own futures would shrink beneath it. The battlefield exposed what no palace ceremony could hide. A title could still call itself imperial. But men followed the lord who protected their land, their reward, their household, their future. The old language of unity remained. The material reality underneath it had changed. Imagine a Frankish soldier at Fontenoy, not as a named fictional hero, but as one of the countless men whose lives entered history only as loss. His boots sink into wet ground. His shield smells of leather, sweat, and old smoke. Across the field he may see men who pray to the same god, serve the same dynasty, perhaps even speak a tongue close enough to understand in shouted fragments. He has not come to fight Saxons. He has not come to defend Rome. He has come because one grandson of Charlemagne disputes the claim of another. That is how imperial language becomes human cost. A decision made in a palace becomes a man waiting in mud. A dispute over inheritance becomes a spear point moving toward a face. And after the field is cleared, after the wounded are carried away, and the dead are counted imperfectly by chroniclers who could barely measure the scale of the grief, the political lesson remains colder than the blood. The empire had not been defeated from outside. It had learned how to kill itself. Then came the Oaths of Strasbourg in 842. This moment can sound dry if treated as a schoolbook footnote. It was not dry. It was one of those rare historical scenes where the fracture becomes audible. Charles the Bald and Louis the German swore an alliance against Lothar, but they did not simply speak in one formal language and expect obedience to follow. Their soldiers had to understand the oath. So the words were rendered in different vernaculars, one associated with the Romance-speaking followers of Charles, the other with the Germanic-speaking followers of Louis. The empire had not only divided armies, it had begun to speak in pieces. The oaths did not create France or Germany in a single dramatic instant. History is rarely so neat. But they revealed something that the Carolingian court could no longer ignore. The lands of the empire were not just territories on a map. They were communities of language, loyalty, law, memory, and local expectation. Charlemagne had ruled across them because he could move through them as conqueror, judge, patron, protector, and sacred king. His grandsons could not. By the time Verdun arrived, the treaty did not feel like a sudden betrayal of unity. It felt like the only language left after brothers had exhausted the language of obedience. Somewhere in the machinery of that settlement, a scribe would have had work to do. Not a dramatic man, not a king, not a warrior, just a clerk with scraped parchment, a sharpened quill, and candle smoke gathering in the rafters above him. He would copy names of places that were not abstract to the people living there. River valleys, monasteries, estates, roads, market towns, fortified centers, lands where men owed service and peasants owed labor. To the scribe, the treaty was ink. To a nobleman, it was opportunity or loss. To a village, it could mean a new lord, a new court, a new demand, a new oath spoken by men who had never plowed the fields they were assigning. That is the hidden violence of partition. It does not always arrive with tortures. Sometimes it arrives as a document. A man brings instructions. The seal is valid. The border has moved. The people remain exactly where they were. And yet, politically, they wake inside another world. This is why the fall of Charlemagne's empire cannot be understood as one single collapse. The palace did not vanish. Aachen did not sink into the earth. Churches still sang. Monasteries still copied books. Counts still rode out under authority. The Carolingian name still mattered. But the center had lost its power to make the whole obey. That loss had a history. It reached back before Verdun, before Fontenoy, before Strasbourg, before the sons of Louis the Pious turned their father's inheritance into a battlefield. It reached back into the very way Frankish power understood family, land, kingship, and reward. To understand why the empire broke, we have to resist the easy explanation. It was not simply that Charlemagne was great and his heirs were weak. That is too simple. It flatters the founder and excuses the system. Charlemagne did not build a modern state with permanent institutions strong enough to ignore the personalities of rulers. He built something more powerful in the short term and more fragile in the long term. A vast network of conquest, aristocratic loyalty, Christian legitimacy, royal command, personal prestige, land distribution, and military obligation. While he lived, the pieces moved around him. After he died, the pieces began moving for themselves. His empire was held together by roads, oaths, bishops, counts, fear, reward, and the memory of victory. But memory cannot replace presence forever. A royal order written in Aachen still had to be obeyed in Aquitaine, Bavaria, Saxony, Italy, and the lands beyond the Rhine. A command could travel, Loyalty had to be renewed, and renewal required a ruler who could convince armed men that obeying him was safer, holier, richer, and more honorable than defying him. Charlemagne had done that. His heirs had to do it while competing with one another. That was the fatal difference. In 814, when Charlemagne died at Aachen, the empire passed to Louis the Pious, his only surviving legitimate adult son. At first glance, this looked like stability. No immediate division among several sons. No repeat of the early rivalry between Charlemagne and his brother Carloman. No great partition at the moment of death. But this was not a solution created by the system. It was a solution created by mortality. Other heirs had died. Circumstance had simplified what Frankish custom might otherwise have complicated. Louis inherited a unity that looked providential, but it was also accidental. The deeper problem waited for the next generation, patient and untouched. How do you pass on an empire that claims to be one Christian order when the political culture around it still expects sons to receive shares? How do you make an imperial title indivisible when land, armies, courts, nobles, and revenues remain divisible? How do you tell a prince raised inside a warrior aristocracy that his brother's supremacy is sacred while his own ambition must be obedient? These were not abstract questions. They were the questions that would tear apart the Carolingian world. And the cruelest part is that many of the decisions that led to disaster were not irrational when they were made. Louis the Pious did not wake up intending to destroy his father's achievement. Lothar did not see himself as a vandal of unity. Charles the Bald did not choose to be born late into a settlement that had already made promises. Louis the German did not defend his inheritance because he hated the empire. Each man acted within pressures created before him. That is how systems fail. Not only through madness, often through reasonable choices made inside an impossible design. The Treaty of Verdun was therefore not the murder weapon. It was the autopsy report. It showed what had already gone wrong. An empire too personal to survive its founder, too sacred to divide cleanly, too large to govern easily, and too tied to family inheritance to remain whole once the family began to disagree. Yet before the map was cut, before the brothers became enemies, before the oaths were spoken in separate tongues, there had been a different story. A story of rise. A story of a dynasty that did not begin as ancient royalty, but as the power behind another dynasty's throne. A story of men who learned that real authority could exist before it wore a crown, and that once the crown became weak enough, it could be taken. So before we follow Charlemagne into Saxon forests, Lombard Italy, Aachen stone halls, and Rome on Christmas Day in the year 800, remember this. Empires do not begin with ruins. They begin with arrangements that once seemed practical. If you want more stories like this, where history is not treated as a list of dates, but as the anatomy of power, subscribe and follow the next chapter. Because Charlemagne's empire did not begin with Charlemagne. It began with a family that discovered the most dangerous truth in politics. A king can be sacred and still be replaced. Before Charlemagne could inherit a kingdom, his family had to teach Europe a dangerous lesson. A crown is not always held by the man who wears it. In the final years of the Merovingian dynasty, the kings of the Franks still possessed the old symbols. They had the hair, the bloodline, the rituals, the ancestral name. They sat where kings were supposed to sit. They appeared in ceremonies. Their existence still mattered because political memory is slow to surrender its old habits. But the power had moved. It had slipped away from the sacred figure on the throne and settled into the hands of another office. The mayor of the palace. That title sounds harmless now, almost domestic, as if it belonged to a servant arranging doors and meals inside a royal household. In the Frankish world, it became something else. The mayor controlled access, managed aristocrats, commanded resources, and increasingly stood at the place where decisions became action. The king remained the face. The mayor became the hand. And once the hand learns it can move without the face is in danger. The Carolingians did not begin as emperors. They began as the men behind weak kings, the family that learned how to rule before it dared to reign. Their rise was not a sudden act of rebellion. It was slower, more practical, and more unsettling. They accumulated military command, aristocratic loyalty, church support, and regional influence until the official dynasty looked less like a government than a costume worn by habit. This is where Charlemagne's story truly begins. Not in Aachen, not in Rome, not with the imperial crown of 800. It begins in the shadow of another dynasty, where the difference between sacred kingship and usable power became impossible to ignore. The Merovingians had once been formidable. Their dynasty reached back to Clovis, the Frankish king who converted to Christianity and gave his rule a sacred Christian dimension. That memory mattered. In early medieval politics, old blood did not simply vanish because a more competent family appeared beside it. The past had weight. Names had gravity. A dynasty could be weak and still feel necessary because people had been taught to imagine order through it. But memory cannot command armies forever. By the 8th century, the Carolingian ancestors had become the force that made Frankish politics work. Among them, Charles Martel stands like a hard iron figure at the edge of the story. Not yet a king, not yet an emperor, but a man whose authority came from war, land, and the ability to make armed men obey. His name means the hammer, and later memory would sharpen that image around the Battle of Tours, or Poitiers, in 732. That battle has often been turned into a simple civilizational myth. Charles Martel saving Christian Europe from Muslim conquest. The reality is more complex, and historians are careful about the scale and meaning of the battle. But for the Carolingian story, one fact matters clearly enough. Charles Martel emerged as the kind of military leader whose power could no longer be dismissed as administrative service. He was not king, but he did what kings were supposed to do. He defended lands. He rewarded followers. He commanded warriors. He dealt with the church when necessary, sometimes as protector, sometimes as a man willing to use church lands to feed military power. His authority was practical before it was ceremonial. That distinction matters. In a world of raids, rival nobles, contested frontiers, and fragile communications, practical authority could become more convincing than ancient blood. A sacred king who cannot protect you begins to look less sacred. A military patron who can protect you begins to look like the real source of order. Imagine a minor Frankish noble in this world, standing in a timber hall that smells of smoke, wet wool, and horse leather. He hears the king's name in formal language, but the summons that matters comes through the network of the mayor. The land grant that matters comes through the men who can enforce it. The campaign that offers plunder, prestige, and survival is organized not by a fading royal figure, but by the family everyone knows has become indispensable. The noble may still bow toward the old dynasty, but he rides for the power that can reward him. That was the quiet revolution. Not a mob storming a palace, not a single dramatic betrayal, a gradual shift in where men expected protection, profit, and command to come from. When Charles Martel died in 741, he left behind no royal title. But he left something more important than a title, a political machine already shaped around his family. His sons inherited the position that mattered. One of them, Carloman, eventually withdrew into religious life. The other, Pepin, later called Pepin the Short, took the final step his father had not taken. He asked the most dangerous question a man behind the throne can ask. If I already hold the power of a king, why should another man hold the name? The question could not be answered by force alone. That is the critical point. Pepin did not simply seize the crown like a warlord kicking aside an old chair. He needed legitimacy. He needed a story that could make replacement look not like ambition, but like order restored. He needed the church. Around 751, Pepin moved against Childeric III, the last Merovingian king. Childeric was deposed, tonsured, and sent into monastic life. The cutting of royal hair was not a trivial detail. Among the Merovingians, long hair carried dynastic meaning. To cut it was to strip away a visible sign of royal identity. It was politics performed on the body. A dynasty did not merely lose an office. It was symbolically disarmed. Here the papacy enters the Carolingian story with lasting consequences. Pope Zachary's judgment, as recorded in later sources, supported the idea that the man with real power should be called king rather than the man who lacked it. The exact texture of the exchange should be treated carefully. Medieval sources often turn political negotiation into moral clarity after the fact. But the outcome is clear enough. The Carolingians received sacred approval for a dynastic replacement. Pepin was anointed. The old dynasty was finished, and a precedent had been created that would haunt the future. Because once kingship depends not only on blood, but on the judgment that a ruler is useful, effective, and blessed by the church, legitimacy becomes more powerful and more vulnerable. This was the bargain at the heart of Carolingian power. The church gained a protector. The Carolingians gained sacred language for a political act. The papacy, under pressure in Italy and threatened by Lombard power, needed strong defenders. The Franks needed a religious vocabulary that could make their rise feel lawful. Each side gave the other what it lacked. Rome offered blessing. The Franks offered arms. It worked, but it also bound the Carolingian future to an unstable truth. A crown could be validated by sacred authority, but that meant sacred authority had a voice in the making of kings. Later, in 800, when Pope Leo III placed an imperial crown on Charlemagne's head in Rome, the gesture would look astonishing. But it did not come from nowhere. It had roots in Pepin's bargain. The Carolingians had already learned that the church could transform power into legitimacy. And the church had already learned that Frankish muscle could protect sacred claims. This alliance made Charlemagne possible. It also made his inheritance more complicated. The Carolingian rise was built on a contradiction that no one could fully escape. They overthrew the Merovingians because real power had moved away from the old royal bloodline. Yet once they became kings themselves, they needed people to treat their own bloodline as sacred. They had benefited from the idea that ineffective kings could be replaced. Now they needed their subjects to forget how useful that idea could be. That is not hypocrisy in the simple sense. It is the normal danger of successful usurpation. A family that climbs to power by exposing the weakness of old legitimacy must spend the rest of its rule proving that its own legitimacy is different. Pepin understood this well enough. He did not rely only on anointing. He fought. He intervened in Italy. He strengthened ties with the papacy. He rewarded nobles. He secured the position of his family through action, not merely symbol. Power in the early Middle Ages had to be repeated. A coronation did not end the work. It began the obligation. And then came the old Frankish problem: inheritance. When Pepin died in 768, he did what Frankish tradition expected. He divided his realm between his sons, Charles and Carloman. The arrangement was normal. That was precisely the danger. Because the Carolingians had just spent generations gathering enough authority to replace a dynasty, now that authority was being divided between brothers, each with his own court, his own followers, his own ambitions, and his own reason to suspect the other. The future Charlemagne did not begin his reign as a lone master of a united world. He began as one heir among two. The kingdom that would become the foundation of his empire was already vulnerable to the family logic that would later destroy his grandsons. Before there was an imperial title to fight over, before Verdun, before Fontenoy, before the Oaths of Strasbourg, there was this simpler and older Frankish habit. A father dies, sons receive portions, and politics becomes a question of whether brothers can tolerate equality. They often could not. In the courts of Charles and Carloman, nobles would have watched carefully. No lord wanted to choose too early and be punished later. No bishop wanted to bless the wrong future. Messengers moved between households. Marriages mattered. Border regions mattered. Even silence mattered, because in a divided inheritance, hesitation could be interpreted as disloyalty by both sides. A kingdom divided among brothers is not automatically a civil war, but it is a room full of dry wood. All it needs is a spark. For a few years, the Frankish world lived with that tension. Charles and Carloman ruled side by side, but not as one. Their mother, Bertrada, attempted diplomacy and family management, moving between the interests of sons, allies, and foreign powers. The machinery of power continued, but beneath it lay the question no ceremony could answer. Which brother would become greater? History gave the answer in the bluntest way. In 771, Carloman died. Suddenly, the danger that might have consumed the Frankish kingdom disappeared. Charles moved quickly. Carloman's widow and children fled to the Lombard court, and Charles absorbed his brother's share. What could have become a long dynastic struggle became instead a consolidation. This was one of the most important accidents in medieval European history. Charlemagne's future greatness depended not only on genius, courage, faith, or military skill. It depended on the disappearance of a rival heir at the right moment. The kingdom became one because the family tree narrowed. That should make us cautious. The later empire would look inevitable in retrospect. Charlemagne the Conqueror, Charlemagne the Reformer, Charlemagne the Emperor. But at the beginning, unity was fragile. It rested on death, speed, aristocratic calculation, and the ability of one surviving brother to turn uncertainty into command. The Carolingians had stolen a crown from the Merovingians by proving that real power mattered more than old blood. Then Charlemagne inherited the Carolingian crown because one branch of the family suddenly lost the contest. The lesson was brutal, but clear. Power could be sanctified. Power could be inherited. Power could be written into ritual, blessed by bishops, sung over in churches, defended by warriors, recorded by monks. But beneath all of it remained a harder truth. The crown belonged to the family only as long as the family could prevent itself from becoming the battlefield. For Charlemagne, that battlefield had been avoided. For his heirs, it was only waiting. And now, with his brother gone and the Frankish realm gathered into his hands, Charles could turn outward, toward Italy, Saxony, Bavaria, the Avars, and finally Rome itself. The family that stole a crown had produced a ruler who would try to turn that crown into an empire. But first, he would have to make Europe afraid of him. A kingdom can survive many enemies. It does not always survive two heirs. When Pepin the Short died in 768, the Frankish realm did not pass whole into the hands of one son. It was divided, as custom expected, between Charles and Carloman. Two brothers, two courts, two centers of loyalty, two futures staring at each other across a kingdom that had only recently learned how dangerous divided authority could become. At first glance, nothing about this was unusual. Frankish inheritance had long treated royal land as something that could be shared among sons. A father's power did not automatically become one indivisible office. It became portions, territories, claims, oaths, expectations. This made sense inside the logic of family. It was deadly inside the logic of empire. But in 768, there was no empire yet. No imperial crown, no Christmas Day in Rome, no Aachen shining as the symbolic heart of a Christian order. There was only the Frankish kingdom, recently taken fully by the Carolingians, now placed into the hands of two young rulers who had every reason to distrust each other. Charles received one portion. Carloman received another, and every noble in the realm had to begin calculating what that meant. Power in the early Middle Ages was never simply a line on a document. It moved through people. Bishops, counts, abbots, warriors, households, widows, marriage alliances, armed retainers, local courts, frontier commanders. When a kingdom was divided, these people did not vanish into neat categories. They watched. They waited. They measured risk. A count might ask himself which brother would last. A bishop might wonder whose favor would protect his lands. A warrior might care less about sacred blood than about which court could reward him. And a mother, Bertrada, widow of Pepin and mother to both kings, stood between two sons whose rivalry threatened everything her family had just won. The Carolingians had replaced the Merovingians only a generation earlier. Their legitimacy was strong enough to rule, but not ancient enough to feel untouchable. They had been anointed. They had papal support. They had military prestige, but they were still a dynasty that had taken the crown by proving that a king without usable power could be removed. That memory mattered. If the Carolingians wanted people to believe their rule was sacred, they first had to avoid looking like another ambitious family fighting over spoils. And yet the structure almost invited it. Two brothers ruling adjacent realms are not merely relatives. They become political alternatives. Every disagreement between them becomes a test of loyalty for others. Every border dispute becomes a possible crisis. Every marriage arrangement becomes strategy. Every rumor gains weight because people understand that the future may belong to one brother, not both. This was the quiet danger around Charles and Carloman. Not open war at first. Something worse in political terms, uncertainty. In the halls where their followers gathered, power would not have felt like a grand theory. It would have felt like smoke from hearth fires, damp cloaks after travel, low voices near doorways, messengers arriving with sealed instructions. A nobleman entering one brother's court might wonder whether he was being seen as loyal or as a man keeping options open. A bishop might phrase a letter carefully enough to offend neither side. A warrior might accept gifts from one court while listening for news from the other. No one needed to say civil war aloud. The possibility lived in the room. Charles was older, ambitious, energetic, and already showing the force that would later define him. Carloman was not a shadow. He had his own kingship, his own supporters, his own legitimate claim. The danger was not that one was real and the other fake. The danger was that both were real. A divided inheritance does not create conflict because one claim is illegitimate. It creates conflict because more than one claim is legitimate at the same time. This is the trap that would later consume Charlemagne's descendants. But here, in the opening years of Charles's reign, the trap was still small enough to be hidden inside family politics. The brothers' relationship was tense. Their mother Bertrada tried to manage alliances, including diplomacy with the Lombards in Italy. Lombard politics, papal anxieties, Frankish ambitions, and family strategy all touched one another. Nothing in this world stayed neatly domestic. A marriage could affect Italy. A brother's distrust could affect Rome. A family quarrel could become foreign policy. That is one reason Charlemagne's later rise cannot be separated from inheritance. Before he conquered others, he first had to survive the danger of sharing power. The kingdom was not waiting peacefully for greatness. It was balancing on a family arrangement that might have broken at any moment. Then, in 771, Carloman died. The political world changed with brutal speed. Death did what diplomacy had failed to guarantee. It removed the rival center. It ended the possibility of a long brotherly struggle before it could mature into full civil war. It gave Charles what no treaty between siblings could have safely given him: the chance to rule alone. But a death in a royal family does not automatically settle everything. Carloman had a widow. He had children. He had followers who had built their future around him. His household did not simply evaporate because his body did. A dead king can still be dangerous if his name gives others something to rally around. Carloman's widow, Gerberga, fled with her children to the Lombard court of King Desiderius. That move mattered. It turned a family question into a geopolitical one. If the Lombards chose to use Carloman's heirs, they could become a living challenge to Charles's control. A boy too young to rule could still be useful in the hands of adults who wanted leverage. Charles understood the danger. He moved quickly to take control of his brother's former territories. Speed was not merely ambition. It was survival. In a world where hesitation allowed factions to grow, a ruler had to turn uncertainty into fact before enemies turned it into rebellion. So the Frankish realm became unified under Charles. Not because the inheritance system had produced harmony, not because brothers had discovered a peaceful formula for shared kingship, because one brother died. This is a crucial point. Charlemagne's empire would later look so vast, so confident, so inevitable that it becomes easy to forget how accidental its foundation was. The unity that made his conquests possible began not as a solved political principle, but as a narrowing of the family tree. Had Carloman lived longer, the story of Europe might have been different. Perhaps the brothers would have fought. Perhaps one would have dominated the other. Perhaps nobles would have split into armed camps. Perhaps the papacy would have had to choose. We cannot turn speculation into history, but we can see the structure clearly enough. The danger was there, and for Charles, its disappearance opened the road outward. Once he became sole king, he could act with a concentration of authority no divided realm would easily have allowed. He could move armies without negotiating with an equal brother. He could answer papal requests with unified force. He could turn against the Lombards. He could begin the long, brutal campaigns against the Saxons. He could make decisions that reshaped borders, because the first border he had overcome was inside his own dynasty. The personal became imperial. A family consolidation became a continental project. Yet the problem was not destroyed. It was only postponed. This is one of the cruel patterns in Carolingian history. Mortality repeatedly appeared to solve what institutions could not. Carloman's death gave Charles unity. Later, the deaths of Charlemagne's own sons would leave Louis the Pious as sole surviving adult, legitimate heir. Twice, death simplified inheritance. Twice, the system looked more stable than it really was. But a political order cannot depend forever on convenient deaths. Eventually, more than one heir survives. Eventually, sons grow old enough to demand portions. Eventually, a father must decide whether the kingdom is a family possession or a sacred unity. And when that day comes, the old questions returns with sharper teeth. For now, Charles had won the first struggle without a battle. He stood alone at the head of the Frankish realm. His rivals were scattered, his brother gone, his authority expanding. The old Merovingian kings had been removed. The Carolingian family had secured the crown, and now one Carolingian held enough power to do what none of his ancestors had done. He could turn a kingdom into a weapon. But weapons require targets. To the south, Italy waited with Lombard kings and papal fears. To the northeast, Saxony waited in forests, shrines, fortresses, and defiance. To the east, Bavaria and the Avar frontier pulled Frankish ambition toward the Danube. Charles had inherited a realm. Now he would test how far that realm could reach, and the answer would make him the most powerful ruler in Western Europe, while planting the burden that his heirs would one day fail to carry. Before Charlemagne became a symbol of European unity, he was a man who knew how to make borders move. Not gently, not through speeches about civilization. Through horses, iron, burned strongholds, forced oaths, captured kings, broken resistance, and the steady arrival of Frankish authority into places that had not asked for it. The empire did not begin as an idea. It began as pressure applied to the map. After Carloman's death in 771, Charles stood alone over the Frankish realm. The first internal danger had passed. No equal brother stood beside him. No rival court divided the loyalty of the great men. The road outward opened, and almost immediately, that road led south. Italy was not merely another prize. It was the place where Frankish ambition, papal fear, Lombard power, and Roman memory collided. The Lombards had long been a force in northern Italy, and their pressure on the papacy made them impossible for the Franks to ignore. Rome needed protection. Charlemagne needed legitimacy. Both needs pointed toward the same battlefield. In 773, Charles crossed the Alps. That image matters. A Frankish king leading his forces through mountain passes into Italy was not just answering a papal request. He was placing himself inside the politics of Rome, inside the old landscape of imperial memory, inside a world where kings could become something larger if they learned how to stand close enough to the altar. The Lombard king Desiderius had once been connected to Frankish diplomacy and family politics. His court had sheltered Carloman's widow and sons after Carloman's death. That made Lombard Italy not just a foreign problem, but a dynastic threat. A surviving branch of the family protected by a rival king could become a weapon. Charlemagne understood that danger. By 774, after the siege of Pavia, Desiderius was defeated. Charles took the title King of the Lombards. He did not merely remove an enemy. He absorbed a kingdom and turned himself into the protector Rome had been asking for. The victory strengthened him immediately. It gave him Italy. It deepened his relationship with the papacy. It gave his rule a southern horizon, no longer confined to the old Frankish world north of the Alps. But it also did something more dangerous. It taught Charlemagne that expansion could solve several problems at once: security, legitimacy, aristocratic reward, religious prestige, and dynastic threat. A campaign could remove an enemy, satisfy nobles, please the church, and make the king look chosen by success itself. That is the seduction of conquest. It makes power feel self-justifying. Then came Saxony. If Italy gave Charlemagne prestige, Saxony gave him a war that would define the violence beneath his order. The Saxon Wars began in 772 and would not truly end until 804. More than 30 years. A generation of fighting. Raids, revolts, conversions, submissions, punishments, renewed resistance, and deeper Frankish intervention into a society that did not simply fold because a Christian king demanded obedience. This was not one clean campaign. It was a grinding frontier struggle. The Saxons were not a centralized kingdom waiting to be captured at the top. Their world was more fragmented, rooted in local leaders, sacred sites, assemblies, and regional loyalties. That made conquest harder. Defeat in one place did not guarantee submission everywhere. A treaty could be sworn, then broken. A baptism could be accepted, then followed by revolt. A fortress could fall, but the forest remained. For Charlemagne, Saxony became the test of whether Frankish kingship could transform a frontier by force. In 772, Frankish forces destroyed the Irminsul, a sacred Saxon object or site remembered by Frankish sources as a major pagan symbol. The exact religious meaning is difficult to reconstruct through hostile Christian writing, but the political meaning is clear enough. Charlemagne was not only attacking warriors, he was attacking the world that made resistance sacred. A sword can kill a man. To rule him, you must also challenge the story that tells him why he should not obey you. That was the deeper violence of the Saxon Wars. Frankish conquest arrived with priests. Military submission came with baptism. The border was not only being moved, belief itself was being disciplined. Imagine a Saxon settlement after a Frankish campaign. The air smells of wet timber, ash, and trampled earth. A wooden structure that once marked local sacred memory has been broken or burned. Men stand under watch. Women keep children close. A priest speaks words in a language not everyone understands, while a Frankish count records names, obligations, and punishments. To the court, this might be called pacification. To the village, it is the arrival of a new universe. The old gods are no longer merely defeated. They are criminalized. Refusal becomes rebellion. Custom becomes disobedience. The frontier is converted into a moral battlefield where resisting the king can be treated as resisting God. This is how Charlemagne's empire expanded, by making conquest administrative and administration sacred. The Saxons did not accept this quietly. Widukind, the Saxon leader whose resistance became central to the Frankish narrative, appears in the sources as a symbol of persistent defiance. He was not always present in the same way a king might be present. He mattered because the resistance needed names, and Frankish memory needed enemies large enough to justify the severity of the response. In 782, after a major Saxon revolt and Frankish losses, Charlemagne ordered a mass execution at Verdun. The royal Frankish annals give the famous figure of 4,500 Saxons killed. Historians still debate the exact context, number, and interpretation of the event, and medieval analysts could shape memory for political purposes. But even if the details are handled cautiously, the event remains one of the darkest anchors in Charlemagne's reign. It reveals the logic of terror at the frontier. This was not merely punishment for crime. It was a message written in bodies. Submission would be enforced not only by battle, but by exemplary violence. After Verdun, the war did not simply end. Violence rarely produces the obedience it imagines. It can break resistance in one place and harden memory in another. Charlemagne continued the long work of forcing Saxony into the Frankish world through campaigns, deportations, settlement, ecclesiastical organization, and law. The Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae, associated with this harsh phase of Saxon policy, threatened severe punishment for practices the Frankish Christian order condemned. The exact dating and application require caution, but its spirit fits the frontier reality. Conversion and obedience were not separate projects. To be Saxon under Frankish rule was increasingly to be told that political submission, Christian baptism, and legal discipline were one demand. This made the empire stronger. It also made it heavier. Every conquered land required more than victory. It needed counts, priests, hostages, roads, assemblies, courts, churches, garrisons, oaths, and repeated demonstrations that the king's command still mattered after the army had moved elsewhere. That was the hidden cost. Expansion widened Charlemagne's reach, but it also multiplied the places where his presence had to be imitated by institutions that were never as frightening as the man himself. The same pattern appeared elsewhere. In Bavaria, Duke Tassilo III represented a different kind of problem. Bavaria was not pagan Saxony, it was Christian, aristocratic, and tied into the Frankish world, but it retained a dangerous degree of autonomy. A semi-independent duke with old prestige and regional loyalty could become a rival center of gravity. In 788, Tassilo was deposed. The details were shaped through formal charges and political judgment, including accusations tied to disloyalty. The result mattered more than the courtroom language. Bavaria was brought under tighter Carolingian control. Charlemagne had learned that frontiers could not be left half-obedient. A powerful duke was useful until he became a possible alternative. By removing Tassilo, Charlemagne weakened regional independence and expanded direct royal authority. But again, victory created work. Bavaria now had to be integrated, watched, administered, and connected to the wider military and ecclesiastical order. Then came the Avars. To the east, beyond Bavaria and toward the Danube, the Avar Khaganate represented both threat and opportunity. Campaigns against the Avars in the 790s opened another frontier and brought extraordinary treasure into Frankish hands. The so-called Avar ring, remembered as a center of Avar wealth, became part of the story of Carolingian triumph. Gold has its own political language. A king who brings wealth back from the frontier can reward followers. He can fund churches. He can strengthen loyalty. He can make conquest feel profitable, even providential. The spoils of the Avar campaigns helped feed the aura of Charlemagne's success. But plunder is not a stable tax system. It rewards the present more easily than it governs the future. Each victory created expectations. Nobles who followed the king expected land, office, honor, and wealth. Warriors expected reward. Bishops expected support. Monasteries expected favor. Frontier communities expected defense. The more Charlemagne conquered, the more the political world around him learned to depend on a ruler capable of producing success again and again. That kind of kingship is magnificent while it works. It is terrifying when it stops. By the end of the 8th century, Charlemagne had become more than a Frankish king. He was ruler of a vast and expanding order. Franks, Lombards, Saxons, Bavarians conquered Avar territories, border zones, church networks, aristocratic households, monasteries, courts, and military roads all tied to his command. The map looked stronger than ever. But maps hide effort. A border drawn outward does not show the messenger exhausted on the road, the hostage taken from a noble family, the village forced into baptism, the count hated by the people he governs, the priest learning how dangerous conversion can be when it arrives beside soldiers, the local leader calculating when to submit and when to revolt. Empire is not simply land colored on parchment. It is the daily labor of making distant people obey. Charlemagne was extraordinarily good at that labor. He moved, he punished, he rewarded, he adapted. He used the church without being merely controlled by it. He used aristocrats without letting them forget who stood above them. He turned war into reform and reform into authority. Yet the question beneath all of it remained unanswered. What happens when the ruler who can do all this is gone? Who keeps Saxony obedient when the memory of terror fades? Who keeps Bavaria loyal when a weaker king needs its nobles? Who keeps Italy attached when Roman politics becomes dangerous again? Who tells armed men from different regions that one imperial command should matter more than their local lord, their inheritance, their language, their immediate interest? For now, Charlemagne did not need to answer fully. His sword answered for him, and in the years ahead, he would build something to make that sword look less like violence and more like order. He would gather scholars, issue capitularies, send royal agents across the realm, strengthen bishops, correct clergy, reform writing, and turn Aachen into a center where conquest could be dressed in stone, prayer, law, and light. The sword had made the empire. Now Charlemagne needed ink, ritual, and God to hold it together. The sword could win obedience. It could not remember names. It could burn a fortress, break a rebellion, force a chieftain to kneel, drag a frontier into submission. But once the army moved on, power had to become something quieter and more difficult. A written order, a traveling messenger, a bishop's instruction, a count's court, a monastery archive, a tax obligation, a prayer spoken in the right form by men who had once obeyed different gods. Charlemagne understood this better than most conquerors. He did not only want to defeat peoples, he wanted to reorganize them. And so, after the campaigns, after the forests of Saxony, the Lombard cities, the Bavarian submission, and the eastern raids against the Avars, Another kind of empire had to be built, not on the battlefield, but in halls, chapels, schools, scriptoria, and councils. At the center of that effort stood Aachen, not Rome, not Paris, not some ancient imperial capital, heavy with old marble and old ghosts. Aachen was more personal, more deliberate, more Carolingian. It became the favored residence of Charlemagne, a place where the rough energy of Frankish kingship could be dressed in architecture, liturgy, learning, and imperial memory. Its palace complex and chapel were not merely buildings. They were arguments in stone. Here, power tried to look permanent. Imagine the palace chapel in the cold light of morning, stone arches, lamps, the smell of wax, clergy moving through ritual space, officials arriving with documents, messengers waiting with mud still on their boots after long roads from Italy, Saxony, Aquitaine, Bavaria, or the Rhine. Somewhere nearby, scribes bend over parchment, cutting quills, mixing ink, copying words that are supposed to travel farther than the king himself. This is the other face of Charlemagne's rule. Not the mounted warrior, the organizer, the corrector, the man who knew that a huge realm could not survive by violence alone. Aachen gave the empire a visible center. But visibility was not enough. The real question was whether commands issued from that center could reach the edges without dissolving into local habit, aristocratic self-interest, bad memory, or deliberate disobedience. That was the problem of governing an early medieval empire. A ruler could not simply click authority into place. He had to send it, on horseback, on parchment, through men whose loyalty could not always be separated from their ambition. Charlemagne's answer was reform. He issued capitularies, royal orders arranged in chapters addressing law, discipline, military duty, church practice, moral conduct, administration, and local obligations. They were not modern legislation in the clean bureaucratic sense. Their force depended on proclamation, repetition, enforcement, and the willingness of local powers to cooperate. But they show the scale of Charlemagne's ambition. He wanted order to be written. He wanted correction to be systematic. He wanted distant regions to understand that conquest had brought them into a moral and political structure larger than their local customs. A capitulary was more than ink. It was the king's voice trying to survive distance. But ink still needed legs. So Charlemagne relied on counts, bishops, abbots, and royal agents. Among the most important were the missi dominici, the envoys of the Lord King, sent to inspect, correct, judge, and report. Often working in pairs, one layman and one churchman, they represented the attempt to make royal authority visible beyond the court. Their mission was simple in theory and difficult in practice: find out whether the king's will was being obeyed. The very existence of the missi reveals both strength and weakness. Strength, because Charlemagne had enough authority to send inspectors across a vast realm and expect them to matter. Weakness, because he needed them at all. If local government naturally obeyed, inspection would be less urgent. If counts never abused power, if bishops never drifted into local politics, if nobles never bent royal commands toward their own interests, if communities never resisted quietly, then the center would not need to keep asking whether its authority was real. The missi were not proof of a perfect machine. They were proof that the machine required constant pressure. Picture one of these royal envoys entering a provincial assembly. He arrives with a companion from the church, carrying documents sealed with royal authority. Local men gather, counts, landholders, clergy, perhaps petitioners with grievances. The room smells of damp wool, horse sweat, and smoke from a hearth that does little to soften the cold. A complaint is raised. A count has taken more than he should. A monastery claims its land has been violated. A poor free man says a powerful neighbor has ignored the king's justice. The envoy listens. The parchment says one thing. Local power says another. That gap between written command and lived reality was where Charlemagne's empire had to fight every day after the battle ended. And this is why the Carolingian project was so ambitious. It did not merely conquer territory. It tried to correct society. The church was essential to this effort. Charlemagne's rule cannot be understood apart from bishops, monasteries, clergy, liturgy, education, and Christian discipline. He saw religious reform not as private piety alone, but as political architecture. A badly trained priest did not merely endanger souls. He endangered order. A monastery was not only a place of prayer. It was a storehouse of books, land, memory, administration, influence, and legitimacy. The realm had to be Christian in the correct way, not vaguely Christian, not locally improvised, corrected, instructed, standardized, disciplined. This is where figures like Alcuin of York enter the story. Alcuin was not a general. He did not conquer Saxony or cross the Alps at the head of an army. But his presence at Charlemagne's court mattered because empires are not held only by men who fight. They are also held by men who teach rulers what order should sound like. Alcuin and other scholars helped shape what later historians call the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of learning, textual correction, education, script, and Christian intellectual culture. The phrase can be misleading if it makes the period sound softer than it was. This was not a gentle academic awakening floating above violence. It was learning inside a system of rule. Books mattered because correct texts meant correct worship. Correct worship meant unity. Unity meant obedience. And obedience, in Charlemagne's world, belonged to both God and king. One of the most enduring material signs of this reform was Carolingian minuscule, a clearer script that made copying and reading text easier across different regions. It is easy to underestimate the political importance of handwriting, but in a world where written authority had to travel through human hands, clarity was power. A badly copied law could distort command. A poorly trained cleric could misunderstand doctrine. A local custom could survive because no one had the textual tools to challenge it. Writing was not decoration. Writing was infrastructure. In a scriptorium, a monk might spend hours over a page, the knife scraping parchment smooth, the quill leaving dark strokes under wavering light. Outside, weather moved over fields and roads. Inside, the empire tried to preserve itself in letters. The monk may not have thought of himself as a servant of imperial strategy. He may have thought of correction, salvation, obedience, learning. But those things were not separate from politics. A clean page could carry a king farther than a horse. A corrected book could make a distant altar speak the same language of authority as the court. A trained cleric could turn local Christianity into Carolingian Christianity. This was the brilliance of Charlemagne's order. It fused the sacred with the administrative so tightly that reform became governance, and governance became moral duty. But the brilliance carried a danger. When rule depends on correction, it must keep correcting. When unity depends on discipline, it must keep disciplining. When authority depends on the cooperation of bishops, abbots, counts, nobles, and envoys, the ruler must keep all of them inside a shared expectation of reward, fear, faith, and obedience. Charlemagne could do that because his presence filled the system. Even when he was absent, people knew he might return. A count who abused power knew that the king had sent inspectors before and could send them again. A rebellious frontier knew that Frankish armies had marched before and could march again. A bishop knew the court cared about doctrine and discipline. A noble knew land and honor flowed through royal favor. The realm did not obey only because institutions existed. It obeyed because those institutions were animated by an extraordinary ruler. That distinction would matter after his death. Aachen could make authority visible, but it could not make future kings equally feared. Capitularies could carry orders, but they could not guarantee compliance under weak leadership. Missi could inspect abuses, but they needed a center strong enough to act on what they found. Monasteries could preserve texts, but they could also become local powers with interests of their own. Charlemagne's reforms strengthened the empire. They also revealed how much labor unity required. This was not a quiet golden age untouched by anxiety. It was a constant act of maintenance. The roads had to be traveled. The laws had to be repeated. The clergy had to be corrected. The nobles had to be watched. The frontier had to be reinforced. The memory of conquest had to be renewed through ritual, writing, judgment, and fear. The palace at Aachen therefore carried two meanings at once. To supporters, it was the heart of a renewed Christian order. To history, it was evidence of a problem no stone chapel could solve. The empire needed a center because the realm was too large, too diverse, and too dependent on personal authority to hold itself together naturally. Every reform asked the same question in a different form. Can ink replace the king's presence? Can ritual make distant men obedient? Can bishops and counts carry unity after the conqueror is gone? For a while, the answer seemed to be yes. The court glittered with learning. The chapel rose. Royal commands traveled. Bishops preached reform. Monks copied books. Envoys rode. The conquered lands were pulled, slowly and unevenly, into a common order. And above it all stood Charlemagne, no longer only the hammer of enemies, but the architect of a Christian realm that wanted to believe it had become more than a kingdom. Yet, Aachen was still not enough. The empire had a court, it had law, it had learning, it had sacred language, but one thing could raise all of it into a new and dangerous height. A crown that claimed not merely Frankish kingship, not merely Lombard rule, but the inheritance of Rome itself. That moment came in a church on Christmas Day in the year 800, and when the Pope placed the crown on Charlemagne's head, the empire gained its most powerful symbol and its most impossible burden. On Christmas Day in the year 800, Charlemagne knelt inside St. Peter's in Rome. The church was not silent. No great ceremony ever truly is. There would have been movement, breath, fabric, incense, murmured prayer, the low pressure of bodies gathered beneath sacred architecture. Rome itself carried the weight of old names: apostles, martyrs, emperors, ruins, bishops, ghosts of a world that had once claimed to rule the Mediterranean. And there, in that city of memory, a Frankish king lowered his head. Pope Leo III placed a crown upon it. When Charlemagne rose, he was acclaimed as emperor, not merely king of the Franks, not merely king of the Lombards, emperor of the Romans. It was one of the most powerful images of the Middle Ages. a warrior king from the north, crowned in the city of the apostles, wrapped in the language of Rome, Christian order, and imperial revival. But images can hide as much as they reveal. The coronation did not simply honor Charlemagne's power. It changed the problem of his power. It transformed a vast Frankish kingdom into something with a larger claim, a more sacred vocabulary, and a more dangerous inheritance. Before that morning, Charlemagne already ruled more than most kings could imagine. He had conquered the Lombards, broken Saxon resistance through decades of war, absorbed Bavaria, pushed against the Avars, and made Aachen into a center of reform and command. His authority reached through bishops, counts, monasteries, oaths, royal envoys, and armies. But the imperial title added another layer. It said his rule was not only successful, it was historical. It belonged to the story of Rome, and Rome was never just a place. Rome was an argument about universal order. The path to that coronation began not with abstract theology, but with danger. Pope Leo III had enemies in Rome. In 799, he was attacked by opponents who attempted to remove him from power. The details of Roman factional politics are tangled, and the sources must be handled carefully. But the political reality is clear enough. Leo needed protection. He turned to the strongest ruler in the Latin West. Charlemagne came to Rome. This was not charity. It was a bargain shaped by necessity. The Pope needed a defender powerful enough to make Roman enemies afraid. Charlemagne needed sacred recognition powerful enough to turn conquest into legitimate order. Each man lacked what the other could provide. Leo had the altar. Charlemagne had the army. Together, they created a moment that would echo for centuries. Historians still debate how much Charlemagne knew in advance about the exact form of the coronation. Later accounts suggest he may not have wanted the Pope's gesture to appear as if papal authority created the emperor. That question matters because ceremonies are never neutral. If the Pope crowns the emperor, who stands above whom? Is the emperor chosen by God through the Church? Is the Pope merely recognizing a power already granted by victory and divine favor? Does the crown descend from heaven, from Rome, from the army, or from political necessity? The ceremony gave an answer beautiful enough for ritual. It left a question dangerous enough for history. Inside St. Peter's, a Roman spectator might have understood the scene in layers. He would see a powerful foreign king. He would see the Pope, recently threatened, now restored beneath Frankish protection. He would hear acclamations that reached backward toward the old Roman world. He would smell incense, wax, stone, human warmth pressed into sacred space. He might not know whether this was restoration or invention, but he would know that something had changed. The old imperial language had found a new body, and that body was Frankish. This did not mean the Western Roman Empire had simply returned. The administration of Augustus had not risen from the grave. The old Senate did not command legions from marble halls. The Mediterranean was not reunited. Constantinople still existed, and the rulers of the Byzantine Empire did not vanish because a pope in Rome crowned a king from the north. That is why the coronation must be treated with precision. It was not a resurrection in the literal sense. It was a claim that the Latin West could have an emperor again, a claim that Roman Christian authority could be attached to Frankish military power, a claim that Charlemagne's conquests were not merely expansions of a family kingdom, but part of a sacred order. Claims matter. Enough people acting as if a claim is true can make it politically real. After 800, Charlemagne's authority had a new language. His court could speak more confidently of empire. His reforms could appear not just as royal correction, but as the ordering work of a Christian emperor. His wars could be remembered inside a grander frame. His relationship with bishops and monasteries gained another level of meaning. Even Aachen, far from Rome, could shine differently because Rome had lent its name to Frankish power. But the crown also made succession more difficult. A kingdom can be divided more easily than an imperial idea. Land can be portioned, titles can be assigned. But what happens to a universal claim when several sons expect inheritance? This was the quiet danger in the glory of 800. The coronation took the old Frankish problem of family division and placed a Roman crown on top of it. It did not erase partible inheritance. It did not abolish aristocratic ambition. It did not remove regional identities. It did not create a centralized state capable of surviving weak rulers without crisis. It made the inheritance heavier. Now, when future Carolingians fought, they would not be fighting only over counties, palaces, tax rights, military service, or royal prestige. They would be fighting over the meaning of empire itself. Who was allowed to carry the universal title? Could there be one emperor and several kings? Could brothers accept hierarchy inside a family that expected portions? Could a sacred office be treated like family property? The ceremony gave Charlemagne a crown. It gave his heirs a problem. And yet, in the moment, the danger would have been easy to miss. That is how political tragedy often works. The symbols are brightest when the structure underneath is most difficult to see. On Christmas Day, 800, the scene was not one of decline. It was grandeur. The Pope restored, the King elevated, Rome invoked, God placed at the center of rule, the past made useful again. For Charlemagne, the title strengthened what he had already built. For Leo III, it secured the Frankish protector he desperately needed. For the Latin Church, it suggested a Christian order in which sword and altar could act together. For the aristocracy, it added prestige to a ruler whose success already rewarded them. Everyone gained something. That is why the moment worked. But every bargain has a hidden price. The papacy, by crowning Charlemagne, inserted itself into the drama of imperial legitimacy. It could claim to bless, recognize, perhaps even make imperial authority visible. Future rulers would have to manage that memory. Future popes would remember the power of the gesture. Future conflicts between emperor and pope would not come from nowhere. They would grow from the ambiguity already present beneath the incense of St. Peter's. And beyond the papal question lay the Byzantine one. In Constantinople, there was already an emperor, or at that particular moment, an empress, Irene, whose rule complicated Western arguments about vacancy and legitimacy. The Eastern Empire had never accepted that Rome's imperial identity had ended in the way the Latin West imagined. From its own perspective, it was the Roman Empire. The city on the Bosporus did not need a Frankish king to resurrect what it believed it still possessed. So Charlemagne's new title created diplomatic tension. Eventually, in 812, Byzantine recognition of Charlemagne's imperial status came in a limited and negotiated form. But recognition did not erase the deeper unease. The West had made a new emperor. The East had not ceased to be Roman. The Christian world now had competing memories of empire. Even triumph required negotiation. That is the part the image alone cannot show. The crown glittered. The politics underneath remained unfinished. Still, the coronation changed the emotional shape of Charlemagne's reign. Before 800, he was already immense. After 800, he became a figure almost too large for ordinary kingship. His court could imagine itself as guardian of Christian order. His laws could sound like correction for a people under God. His wars could be framed not only as security, but as the expansion of a disciplined Christian world. This gave his rule power. It also made failure more humiliating for those who came after him. A weak king can disappoint. A weak emperor endangers the meaning of the title. When Charlemagne's descendants later fought one another, they would not merely expose a family quarrel. They would expose the fragility of the imperial story created in Rome. If the emperor could not command his brothers, if grandsons could divide the realm, if oaths had to be spoken in different tongues, then what exactly had been crowned in 800? A man? A dynasty? A church alliance? A temporary arrangement dressed as eternity? The answer depended on who was speaking. Charlemagne would not have described it as fragility. No ruler at the height of success thinks of his own triumph as a future problem. He had reason to believe the coronation confirmed reality rather than disguised weakness. His armies had won. His reforms were moving. His court was alive with learning. His enemies had been punished. Rome had honored him. God, in the language of the age, seemed to favor the work, and for a while that was enough. The empire stood. Aachen shone. The title carried weight. But the crown of 800 did not solve the oldest Carolingian question. It made it more dangerous, because from that day forward, the inheritance of Charlemagne was no longer only land, armies, churches, tribute, and frontier obligations. It was Rome. It was sacred order. It was the terrifying expectation that one family could hold together what it had taken a continent to imagine. And as Charlemagne aged, that expectation would move from glory into anxiety. Sons would die. Plans would change. The great ruler would look towards succession, and the empire would depend on a fragile mercy it could never command. That the right heirs would survive, and not too many of them. The old emperor had outlived too many possibilities. That was the strange fortune of Charlemagne's final years. A ruler who had spent his life forcing order onto the map now found that succession, the one frontier no army could conquer, had been simplified for him by death. Not by wisdom, not by law, not by some flawless imperial design, by death. In Aachen, the empire seemed solid. The palace chapel stood as an argument in stone. The court still gathered around the old ruler. Clerics still copied texts. Messengers still moved through the roads of the Frankish world. Counts, bishops, abbots, warriors, envoys, all of them still turned toward the man whose name had become the center of political gravity in the Latin West. But beneath that surface, another question waited. What happens when Charlemagne is no longer there to make the whole system obey? The empire had been built through conquest, correction, ritual, and fear. It had been dressed in the language of Rome on Christmas Day, 800. It had been organized through capitularies, royal envoys, monasteries, bishops, and aristocratic obligation. It looked more than personal. It wanted to look institutional, yet every road still led back to one man. That was the hidden weakness of Charlemagne's greatness. He had become so large that the empire seemed to possess unity through him. His authority settled disputes before they matured. His reputation reached places where his body could not. His victories gave weight to his commands. His punishments made disobedience expensive. His favor made ambition useful. But a reputation cannot be inherited like a cloak. A son can receive a crown. He cannot automatically receive the fear his father inspired. The problem was not new. Frankish kings had long divided lands among sons. This was not seen as absurd in a world where kingship remained tied to family, property, and personal rule. But Charlemagne's title had made the old habit dangerous. He was no longer only king of the Franks. He was emperor. His authority claimed a higher unity than a normal family estate. An empire wants to be one. A royal family often wants portions. Between those two desires lay the future civil war. Charlemagne himself had once benefited from the disappearance of a rival heir. When his brother Carloman died in 771, the Frankish realm became one under Charles. That unity did not prove the inheritance system was stable. It proved that death had removed the test. Now, near the end of his life, the same pattern returned. Charlemagne had sons, and one by one, the family tree narrowed. Pepin of Italy, his son who had ruled as king in Italy, died in 810. Charles the Younger, another son and expected heir within the Frankish heartland, died in 811. These deaths mattered far beyond private grief. They reshaped the political future of Europe. They removed potential rival claimants. They simplified what could have become a division of power among several adult heirs. By the time Charlemagne approached the end, Louis of Aquitaine, later known as Louis the Pious, stood as the main surviving legitimate adult son. The empire had avoided immediate partition again. But once more it had not solved the problem. It had merely escaped it. Imagine a palace official in Aachen, updating records after another royal death. The room is dim. Wax softens beside a flame. A knife scrapes old parchment. Names that once represented political futures now become memorial facts. A son who might have ruled Italy is gone. Another who might have commanded the Frankish heartland is gone. The official does not need to understand grand theory to feel the tremor beneath the work. Every erased possibility strengthens Louis. Every erased possibility also proves how fragile the design had been. This is the material side of succession. It is not only a family tree in a chronicle. It is letters sent to nobles, oaths adjusted, expectations rewritten, offices recalculated, marriages reconsidered, regional elites asking whether their future lies with a living prince, a dead prince's memory, or the old emperor's final command. When sons die in a dynasty, grief does not travel alone. It brings administration with it. Charlemagne responded by preparing Louis. In 813, at Aachen, Louis was crowned co-emperor. The exact ceremonial details and later interpretations require care, but the meaning is clear. Charlemagne wanted to secure continuity before death could turn succession into a battlefield. It was a rational decision, a necessary decision, and, in the short term, a successful one. By elevating Louis while still alive, Charlemagne reduced uncertainty. The great men of the realm could see the intended heir. The transition could be framed as order, not scramble. The empire would not have to wait until the emperor's body was cold before asking who held authority. But the deeper weakness remained untouched. Louis was not inheriting a simple throne. He was inheriting a landscape of obligations that had been made manageable by Charlemagne's personal dominance. He would have to command Italy, Aquitaine, Saxony, Bavaria, the Frankish heartlands, frontier zones, bishops, monasteries, aristocrats, and royal kin. He would have to carry the imperial title without the same record of conquest. He would have to make men obey not because he had built the system, but because he had received it. That is a very different kind of power. Founders can frighten people with memory. Heirs must persuade people that memory still matters. In January 814, Charlemagne died at Aachen. The empire did not immediately fall apart. That is important. There was no instant collapse, no dramatic tearing of the map the next morning, no sudden disappearance of Carolingian authority. Louis inherited the whole imperial structure, and for a moment the transition seemed to prove that Charlemagne's work could survive him. The chapel remained, the court remained, the documents remained, the bishops remained, the name remained, but beneath continuity lay a harsher truth. Louis had inherited the empire because circumstances had protected him from the hardest version of the inheritance problem. He did not have to fight adult brothers for equal portions of Charlemagne's realm. Death had done the work that law had not. The next generation would not be so lucky. Louis would have sons of his own. They would grow into men with courts, followers, expectations, and fears. They would not think of themselves as decorative heirs waiting politely for unity to bless them. They would understand, as Frankish princes had always understood, that royal blood carried claims. They would expect portions. They would suspect one another. They would measure every settlement as either justice or theft. And because Charlemagne had made the inheritance imperial, their conflict would be larger than a family dispute. It would become a war over the meaning of the empire itself. This is why Charlemagne's final years are so tragic. Outwardly, they look like fulfillment. The conqueror aging inside the center he built, the emperor preparing his son, the realm intact, the title secure, the court still capable of projecting order, but fulfillment can hide postponement. Charlemagne left behind the most powerful political creation in the Latin West. He also left behind a question that no campaign, council, coronation, or capitulary had answered clearly enough. Was the empire a sacred unity, or was it still, beneath all the Roman language, a family inheritance? Louis the Pious would spend his reign trying to answer that question. He would try to govern morally. He would try to reform. He would try to preserve unity. He would try to provide for his sons without destroying the whole. And with each attempt, the contradiction would become sharper, because Charlemagne had left his heir not only a throne, but an impossible expectation: to be less than the founder, yet somehow hold together everything the founder's greatness had forced into being. The old emperor died in Aachen. The empire survived the funeral. But the funeral did not bury the danger. It passed it to a son. Louis did not enter history as a conqueror standing over broken enemies. He entered it as a son walking into his father's shadow. In 814, when Charlemagne died at Aachen, the empire did not collapse. That was the first illusion. The court still functioned. The chapel still stood. Bishops still prayed. Sound counts still held office. Messengers still rode across the roads of the Frankish world, carrying instructions sealed in royal authority. The name of Charlemagne remained heavy enough to press obedience out of men who had served him for decades. But the man was gone, and that absence changed everything. Louis the Pious inherited a realm that stretched across a continent of obligations. The Frankish heartlands, Aquitaine, Italy, Saxony, Bavaria, frontier zones, monasteries, bishoprics, aristocratic households, royal estates, roads, courts, and memories of conquest that had not yet cooled into loyalty. He did not inherit a quiet state. He inherited a system still vibrating from his father's will. The tragedy of Louis begins here. He is often remembered as weaker than Charlemagne, and in the blunt language of political memory, that comparison has followed him like a sentence. But comparison can be cruel when it ignores the difference between building power and inheriting it. Charlemagne had made the empire through victory. Louis had to make it obey through continuity. That is harder than it sounds. A founder can demand loyalty because he has already proven what refusal costs. His victories are fresh. His punishments are remembered. His generosity has created careers. His enemies have become examples. But an heir must convince the same world that the father's authority has passed fully into a new body. The crown moves faster than fear. Louis was not an incapable man. He had ruled Aquitaine before becoming emperor. He understood administration, religion, royal duty, and the language of Christian kingship. His reputation for piety was not simply personal softness. It was a political vision. He believed rulership had to be morally ordered. He believed the empire should be corrected, disciplined, purified, made more Christian not only in name but in conduct. In another world, that might have strengthened him. In this one, it placed him inside a dangerous contradiction. The empire Louis inherited had been forged by war, aristocratic reward, coercion, frontier violence, and sacred reform. To govern it as a Christian conscience meant confronting men who had grown powerful inside the rougher habits of Frankish rule. The court could be corrected, abuses could be condemned, royal behavior could be moralized. But every correction touched someone's advantage. Piety was not separate from politics. It was a weapon, and it could be turned back against the ruler who used it. At Aachen, Louis began by reshaping the court. He removed certain figures associated with his father's household. He emphasized reform and discipline. He tried to make the imperial center morally serious, more visibly Christian, less tolerant of disorder. This was not a decorative change. In Carolingian politics, the court was not merely where the ruler lived. It was where legitimacy was performed. If the court looked corrupt, the ruler's authority suffered. If the court looked corrected, the ruler could claim to be renewing the empire. But reform always asks the same question. Who is being corrected, and who benefits from the correction? Imagine a court servant in Aachen during those early years, watching old faces disappear from familiar corridors. The smell of wax and damp wool hangs in the air. Clerics move with greater confidence. Men speak more carefully near doorways. A joke once safe may no longer be safe. A patron who once opened doors may lose influence. A new bishop's approval may matter more than an old warrior's favor. To the emperor, this is purification. To those displaced, it may feel like accusation. Louis wanted a Christian empire worthy of its title. But the empire had not been built by saints. It had been built by men who expected reward, rank, land, voice, and memory. If reform seemed to threaten the balance of honor, it could create enemies without ever declaring war. Then came the crisis of Bernard of Italy. Bernard was Charlemagne's grandson, the son of Pepin of Italy, and he ruled in Italy under the larger Carolingian order. His position was both useful and dangerous. Useful because local kingship could help manage distant regions. Dangerous because every Carolingian prince with territory, blood, and followers could become an alternative center of loyalty. In 817, Louis issued the Ordinatio Imperii, the great settlement that attempted to define how the empire would be inherited. That document belongs fully to the next chapter, because it was the clearest attempt to solve the succession problem. But even before its consequences unfolded, its existence revealed the pressure Louis felt. He knew the empire could not simply be left to chance. He knew inheritance had to be organized. He knew that if every son or royal relative claimed independently, Charlemagne's achievement could become a battlefield. Bernard of Italy seems to have feared what the new order meant for his own position. In 817, he rebelled. The uprising did not become a vast, successful war, but its political meaning was serious. A member of the Carolingian family, ruling a key region, challenged the emperor's settlement. Louis responded. Bernard was captured. In 818, he was punished by blinding, a penalty intended to remove him from political life without direct execution. But Bernard died from the punishment. This death wounded Louis's reign, not because it was unusual for early medieval power to be harsh. It was harsh everywhere. But because Louis's own political identity rested on Christian morality. A ruler who presents himself as a corrected, pious emperor cannot easily absorb the stain of a kinsman dying after punishment ordered under his authority. The empire had seen violence before. It had not always seen violence turn into a moral crisis at the center. Louis later performed public penance. This was not a private emotional scene invented for drama. It was part of the political and religious culture of the age. The emperor acknowledged sin before God, clergy, and the moral order he claimed to defend. In Christian terms, this might show humility. In imperial terms, it was dangerous, because sacred kingship depends on more than goodness. It depends on distance. Majesty requires the ruler to stand above ordinary failure, or at least to make failure politically survivable. When an emperor publicly lowers himself under judgment, he may save his soul in the eyes of the church. But he also teaches ambitious men that the emperor can be judged. The bishops saw a penitent ruler. The aristocracy saw a ruler who could be pressured through moral language. The royal family saw that authority could be made vulnerable. This is the central tragedies of Louis the Pious. His seriousness did not protect him. It exposed him. Charlemagne had used Christianity to strengthen rule. Louis tried to live under its demands more visibly. But when the ruler invites moral judgment into the center of politics, he gives his enemies a powerful vocabulary. They no longer need to say only, "He is weak," or "He has denied my inheritance." They can say, "He has sinned. He has failed the order he claims to represent. He must be corrected." That vocabulary would return later with devastating force. For now, Louis still ruled. He still held the imperial title. He still commanded loyalty. He still had sons whose futures had to be arranged. He still had bishops who believed in the reforming mission of Christian empire. He still had the institutions Charlemagne had strengthened: capitularies, councils, monasteries, royal estates, written commands, aristocratic service. But each of those strengths had a crack inside it. The title required unity. The sons required portions. The bishops offered legitimacy, but also judgment. The aristocrats offered service, but expected reward. The church offered moral order, but could turn morality into political pressure. The empire still stood, but Louis's reign began to reveal how difficult it was to keep every part of Charlemagne's inheritance aligned. A lesser ruler might have ignored the problem, until it exploded. Louis tried to solve it. That is what makes his story more painful. He was not blind to the danger. He understood that succession had to be planned. He understood that an imperial realm could not simply be divided casually without weakening the whole. He understood that his sons needed defined futures before ambition turned into armed rivalry. So in 817, he attempted one of the most important political acts of the Carolingian age. He tried to write the future down. The Ordinatio Imperia was meant to preserve the unity of the empire while still providing for royal sons. It would elevate Lothar, assign roles to his brothers, and create a hierarchy inside the family before the family could tear itself apart. On parchment, it looked like wisdom. In practice, it would become a trap. Because a succession plan does not remove ambition. It gives ambition a document to fight over. And Louis, the pious son of a conquering father, was about to discover that an empire can survive rebellion, frontier war, even the death of its founder, and still be endangered by the way a father divides love, land, and legitimacy among his children. The most dangerous document in an empire is not always a declaration of war. Sometimes it is a plan for peace. In 817, Louis the Pious tried to do what his father had never fully needed to do. He tried to design the future before death could throw the empire into confusion. He tried to make inheritance obey a higher order. He tried to place the Carolingian family inside a structure strong enough to preserve what Charlemagne had built. It was an intelligent act. That is what makes it tragic. The Ordinatio Imperii was not the work of a ruler who ignored danger. It was the work of a ruler who saw danger clearly and believed it could be contained by hierarchy, law, prayer, and political discipline. Louis understood the problem. An empire that claimed unity could not be treated like an ordinary estate divided equally among sons. If every royal heir received an independent kingdom with full authority, the imperial order would become a family arrangement with ceremonial language placed over it. And yet sons could not simply be denied. Frankish kingship did not exist in a world where younger princes quietly disappeared from politics. Royal sons expected futures. Their followers expected rewards. Regional elites expected patrons. A prince without land could become a grievance. A prince with land could become a rival. Louis had to solve both problems at once. He had to keep the empire one. He had to give his sons something. The Ordinatio Imperii attempted precisely that. Lothar, the eldest son, was elevated as co-emperor and placed above the others. His brothers, Pepin and Louis, received subordinate kingdoms, Pepin in Aquitaine, Louis in Bavaria, but within a larger imperial hierarchy. The idea was elegant on parchment. One empire, one senior imperial heir, multiple royal sons with defined places beneath the whole. It was a compromise between unity and division. And compromises are dangerous when each side believes it has surrendered too much. To Louis, the arrangement may have looked like order. To Lothar, it gave recognition to his seniority and tied the future of the empire to him. To Pepin and Louis the German, it gave lands but also limits. They were not excluded, but neither were they equal to their elder brother. The document created peace by naming rank. But to name rank is also to name humiliation. Imagine the scene not as a melodramatic council full of invented speeches, but as a political reality made of parchment, seals, and watching eyes. Clerics approve the sacred logic of unity. Great men listen for what the settlement means to their own lands. A prince hears his future described in careful language and understands the part that is not said aloud. Your brother stands above you. A scribe copies the terms with steady hands. The ink dries, but ambition does not. The ordinatio was meant to prevent the empire from becoming a battlefield after Louis's death. Instead, it gave every member of the family a legal memory to defend. From that point forward, any revision could be treated not merely as a change, but as a betrayal of the established order. That was the hidden cost. A vague future can be negotiated. A written future can be violated. Louis had created a structure strong enough to matter, but not strong enough to silence everyone it disappointed. He had given Lothar a sacred expectation of supremacy. He had given the younger sons defined kingdoms that could become bases of resistance. He had given the aristocracy a map of future loyalties, and he had given the church a vision of imperial unity that could later be used to judge him if he disturbed it. The plan almost worked because it understood the problem. It failed because understanding a problem is not the same as escaping it. At the center was the imperial title itself. Lothar's elevation suggested that the empire could continue as a single order under one senior ruler. This answered the Roman and Christian imagination of unity. There should be one emperor, one supreme guardian of the Christian people, one head of the political body Charlemagne had made. But the Frankish family system did not naturally bend to that vision. Pepin of Aquitaine had a kingdom. Louis the German had Bavaria. These were not decorative holdings. They were regions with nobles, military resources, local identities, courts, and expectations. A prince who ruled such a region learned how power felt in his own hands. Men came to him for favor. Warriors followed him. Bishops negotiated with him. Local elites attached their futures to his survival. A subordinate king may begin as part of a hierarchy. He can become the center of a faction. That is why the ordinatio carried civil war inside its design. It created princes strong enough to rule, but told them their strength must remain obedient to an elder brother. It gave them political bodies, and then asked them not to develop independent political wills. For a time, obedience could be maintained because Louis still lived. The father remained above the sons. The emperor still had the authority to frame the arrangement as sacred order rather than personal preference. But every succession plan has one enemy it cannot defeat: time. Son's age. Followers happen. Children are born. Old fears change shape. What looked stable in 817 could become intolerable later because the people inside the settlement did not remain fixed. And then came the problem no document can fully anticipate. Life continued. Louis remarried. Judith of Bavaria entered the court. In 823, she gave birth to Charles, later known as Charles the Bald. A child was born. A settlement trembled. This is where the tragedy sharpens. Charles did not choose to become a political crisis. He was an infant. But dynastic systems do not wait for children to become adults before assigning meaning to their existence. A royal birth is never merely domestic. It creates claims before it creates words. The ordinatio had already divided the future among Louis's existing sons. Now there was another son. What was Louis supposed to do? Ignore him? Deny him a portion? Treat the child of his lawful marriage as if he did not belong to the Carolingian inheritance? That would create one kind of injustice. But revising the settlement would create another. For Judith, the question was urgent and human. Her son needed a future. For Louis, It was paternal, political, and imperial at the same time. For the older sons, it looked like danger entering the nursery, because every portion given to Charles had to come from somewhere. No land appears from nothing. No royal future is cost-free. To provide for the youngest son meant altering the expectations of the elder sons, and that meant the ordinatio was no longer a sacred solution. It became a contested document. A plan designed to end uncertainty had produced a new form of it. In the court, whispers grew around Judith. Later, hostile sources and political enemies would often make women at court appear as manipulators when succession changed against male expectations. We have to be careful here. Judith should not be turned into a convenient villain, a dark queen moving men like pieces on a board. That is too easy and too close to the propaganda of threatened factions. Her position was simpler and more dangerous. She was a mother trying to protect her son in a world where maternal success could be described by enemies as corruption. The older sons did not need to hate Charles personally to fear what he represented. His existence meant the future could be reopened. It meant promises could be revised. It meant Lothar's supremacy might be adjusted. Pepin's interests threatened, Louis the German's expectations reduced. It meant their father's love, law, and imperial authority could be used to rearrange the inheritance. In a dynasty, a baby can become a border dispute. The court atmosphere must have changed, not in the cartoonish way of secret corridors and whispered poison, but in the real way power changes a room. Men choose their words differently. A bishop's sermon on unity may sound like support for one faction. A gift to one prince may be read as a signal against another. A land grant becomes evidence. A delay becomes suspicion. A queen's household becomes a political camp whether it wants to or not. This was the world the ordinatio had created after Charles's birth. The document still existed. But now it had to compete with blood. Louis began trying to adjust the settlement to make room for Charles. The older sons reacted not as spoiled children, but as political actors defending what they believed had been promised. Their opposition was dangerous precisely because it had logic. They could argue that the original plan had been made for the good of the empire. They could claim that revision weakened unity. They could frame their resistance not as rebellion, but as defense of rightful order. That is how family conflict becomes constitutional crisis. Everyone claims to be protecting the true inheritance. Lothar could defend imperial unity. Pepin could defend Aquitaine. Louis the German could defend his assigned future. Judith could defend Charles. Louis the Pious could defend paternal duty and imperial flexibility. Each position contained enough truth to be dangerous. The Ordinatio Imperii failed not because it was foolish, but because it tried to freeze a living dynasty inside a political design. It assumed the future could be arranged while the family was still changing. It assumed hierarchy could restrain ambition once territory had given that ambition a base. It assumed sons would accept being placed inside an imperial order more readily than they would defend their own claims. The empire was not falling because no one had planned. It was falling because the plan gave everyone something to fight for. And beneath all of this lay the older Carolingian contradiction. Charlemagne had raised the Frankish realm into imperial language. Louis tried to make that language hereditary and orderly, but the social foundations remained those of a warrior aristocracy. Regional loyalties, sacred kingship, personal oaths, and sons who expected inheritance. A modern state can sometimes survive a disappointing heir because offices remain. A personal empire trembles every time a child is born. By the late 820s, the settlement of 817 had become less a solution than a memory weapon. Each faction could point backward and say, "This was promised. This was violated. This was sacred. This was stolen." The parchment had not prevented conflict. It had given conflict a script, and soon the sons of Louis would move from resentment to open rebellion. The father who had tried to save Charlemagne's empire with a succession plan would face the nightmare every dynastic ruler fears. Children old enough to command armies, followers eager enough to justify betrayal, and a political world ready to describe family war as the defense of order. The empire had survived Saxon forests. It had survived Lombard kings. It had survived Avar frontiers. Now it would have to survive the nursery, the marriage bed, the council chamber, and the claims of sons who believed that obedience to their father might mean the destruction of their own future. The most dangerous sound in the palace was not always the clash of weapons. Sometimes it was a child crying in a cradle. In 823, Judith of Bavaria gave birth to a son. His name was Charles. Later, history would call him Charles the Bald. But in that first moment, he was not yet a king, not yet a rival, not yet a man whose name would stand beside the Treaty of Verdun. He was an infant wrapped in cloth, breathing inside a world that had already been divided before he arrived. That was the problem. The Ordinatio Imperii of 817 had attempted to settle the future. Lothar, the eldest son of Louis the Pious, had been elevated as co-emperor. Pepin had his place in Aquitaine. Louis the German had Bavaria. The empire was supposed to remain one, but the sons had been given defined positions inside it. Then Charles was born, and a living child entered a written plan. No document knows what to do with a newborn. For Louis, the question was not abstract. This was his son, a legitimate son born of a lawful marriage, carrying Carolingian blood. To ignore him would be politically cruel and personally impossible. To provide for him meant reopening a settlement already presented as the guardian of imperial unity. For Judith, the question was sharper still. She was not merely a queen beside an aging emperor. She was the mother of a boy whose future depended on her ability to survive the suspicion of men who had already received promises. A royal child does not wait until adulthood to become dangerous. His existence alone creates a claim. The older sons understood this immediately. They did not need to hate the infant to fear him. Charles represented subtraction. Any land given to him had to come from somewhere. Any dignity created for him had to alter someone else's expectation. Any change in the succession could be described as a wound to the order of 817. The palace had acquired a new center of gravity, a cradle. Around it gathered hope, resentment, calculation, and dread. Judith herself stood in a perilous position. Medieval political writing often treated powerful royal women with suspicion, especially when inheritance changed after their arrival. A queen who defended her child could be described as manipulative. A mother seeking security for her son could be accused of corrupting the king's judgment. The sources around Judith carry the smell of factional hostility, and any honest telling has to move carefully through that smoke. She should not be turned into a convenient villain. That would be too easy. Her ambition, if we can call it that, was also a duty, to make sure Charles did not become a prince without a future. But in a court already filled with adult heirs, that duty looked like a threat. Imagine a servant in the imperial household during these years, someone whose name never entered the annals. She carries linen through a corridor where the air smells of wax, wool, and old stone. Behind one door, clerics speak of unity. Behind another, nobles measure the queen's influence in lowered voices. Somewhere nearby, the child is being nursed, too young to understand that men far older than him are already imagining borders around his life. The servant does not need to hear a council decree to know the palace has changed. People pause before speaking. Messengers are watched. Gifts are interpreted. A smile toward the Queen's household becomes political evidence. That is what succession does to a court. It turns ordinary gestures into signs. By the late 820s, Louis began trying to provide Charles with a portion. In 829, he assigned lands to the young prince, carving space for him within the Carolingian future. The exact territorial arrangements shifted and require careful handling, but the political effect was unmistakable. The settlement of 817 had been reopened. To Louis, this may have seemed necessary. To Judith, it was protection. To Charles, though he could not yet know it, it was the beginning of a career defined by survival. To the older sons, it looked like betrayal. Lothar had been promised imperial seniority. Pepin and Louis had been given their kingdoms within that order. They had built expectations around it. Their supporters had built expectations around them. Great men in Aquitaine, Bavaria, Italy, and the Frankish heartlands had already begun to imagine the future through the structure of 817. Now the father was changing the map. A revised inheritance does not merely disturb princes, it disturbs everyone attached to them. A noble who expected favor under Pepin might fear losing it under a new arrangement. A bishop who had aligned himself with one prince might suddenly need to explain his loyalty. A regional aristocracy might wonder whether the emperor in Aachen understood the balance of power on the ground. Succession is never only about family. It is about every man whose property, office, safety, and ambition depend on the family. This is why Charles's birth mattered so much. It did not create ambition from nothing. It activated every anxiety the ordinatio had tried to contain. The court began to polarize. Judith's enemies found a target in her influence. Bernard of Septimania, a powerful figure at court, became associated with her faction in the hostile imagination of opponents. Later accusations and rumors implied scandal, even sexual misconduct. But these claims must be treated with caution. In a court war, reputation is a weapon. A queen does not need to be guilty for enemies to understand the usefulness of making her appear guilty. The accusation itself reveals the politics. If opponents could portray Judith as corrupting Louis, then resistance to the emperor could be presented as defense of proper order. "We are afraid of losing land," they could say. "The realm is being misled." They did not have to say, "Charles threatens our future." They could say, "The Queen has poisoned the judgment of the emperor." This is one of the oldest tricks in dynastic politics. Turn a material dispute into a moral emergency. Louis's pious kingship made him vulnerable to precisely this move. His authority depended on the language of Christian order, correction, unity, and moral rule. But once politics speaks in moral language, every enemy becomes a potential reformer. Every faction claims to defend righteousness. Every rebellion can dress itself as rescue. Judith became the face of disorder because the real disorder was harder to admit. The real disorder was structural. The empire had too many legitimate expectations. Lothar's expectation was legitimate. Pepin's expectation was legitimate. Louis the German's expectation was legitimate. Charles's need for provision was legitimate. Judith's protection of her son was legitimate. Louis's desire to remain father to all his sons was legitimate. And that was precisely why the situation was so dangerous. Crises are not always created by one false claim attacking one true claim. Sometimes they are created by several claims that all contain enough truth to fight for. By 830, the resentment broke into open rebellion. The older sons moved against their father's regime. The immediate crisis involved opposition to the influence around Judith and Bernard of Septimania. But beneath the accusations lay the deeper inheritance problem. The empire was not simply asking whether a queen had too much power. It was asking whether Louis had the right to revise the future after promising a structure of unity. The rebellion of 830 did not yet bring the final catastrophe. Louis would recover. Judith would return. The family would continue its cycle of settlement, suspicion, revolt, and restoration. But the pattern had now been exposed. A father could no longer adjust the inheritance without his sons treating the adjustment as war. That was the trap. Louis still possessed the imperial title. He still had supporters. He still had the sacred language of Christian kingship. But the emotional authority of fatherhood had weakened. His sons had learned that resistance could work. Their followers had learned that imperial policy could be challenged. The Queen's enemies had learned that suspicion could mobilize men more effectively than law. And Charles, still young, had become the living proof that the Carolingian system could not adapt peacefully to its own bloodline. There is a cruel irony here. The empire that Charlemagne built had survived because death simplified succession at crucial moments. Carloman died, leaving Charles to rule alone. Charlemagne's elder sons died, leaving Louis to inherit the whole. Again and again, mortality had hidden the weakness of the system. But Charles the Bald was born. Life, not death, broke the illusion. A new son forced everyone to confront what had always been there. The empire had no clean answer for how to preserve unity while honoring multiple heirs. It could not deny sons without creating resentment. It could not satisfy sons without dividing strength. It could not elevate one heir without humiliating others. It could not revise plans without making earlier promises look disposable. The child in the cradle did not destroy the empire. He revealed the design flaw, and once revealed, it could not be unseen. From this point forward, the politics of Louis's reign would grow darker. The conflict would no longer remain inside documents and whispered accusations. Sons would abandon their father. Armies would gather. Bishops would judge. The emperor who had once tried to make the inheritance orderly would find himself standing beneath the weight of his own family's claims. In Charlemagne's day, rebellion had often come from conquered peoples, frontier leaders, or rival powers. Under Louis, rebellion came from the dinner table. The next crisis would show how far the sacred majesty of an emperor could fall when the men who challenged him carried his blood, his name, and his future in their hands. An emperor can survive a defeat. It is harder to survive humiliation. By the early 830s, Louis the Pious still wore the imperial title. He still stood at the center of the Carolingian world. His court still issued commands. Bishops still spoke of Christian order. Nobles still attended assemblies. The language of unity had not disappeared, but language was beginning to fail. The empire had entered a darker stage where every political disagreement could be turned into a moral accusation, and every moral accusation could become a weapon in the hands of family. Louis had tried to solve inheritance by law. He had tried to preserve unity through the Ordinatio Imperii of 817. He had tried to provide for Charles, the son born later to Judith of Bavaria. And with each adjustment, each effort to balance fatherhood and empire, he convinced one group of heirs that another group was being favored. This was the trap that closed around him. A king may command strangers with fear. He must command sons through a much more fragile mixture: love, expectation, authority, memory, and inheritance. Louis had sons who were no longer children. Lothar had imperial ambition and the dignity of seniority. Pepin had Aquitaine and the networks that came with regional rule. Louis the German had Bavaria and his own future to defend. Charles, though younger, had Judith and the emperor's concern behind him. Each son was not merely a person. Each son was a political system gathering around a body. That is why rebellion became possible. Not because one prince woke up evil, because each prince had followers who could describe his fear as justice. The rebellion of 830 was the first great warning that Louis's authority could fracture from within. Opposition gathered against the influence surrounding Judith and Bernard of Septimania. But that was only the surface. Beneath the accusations lay the deeper issue. The older sons believed their father was altering the balance of inheritance in favor of the younger Charles. In dynastic politics, a change in favor is never just emotional. It moves land. It moves offices. It moves futures. When the sons acted against their father's government, they were not simply attacking a queen's household. They were testing whether imperial authority could still control the royal family. For a moment, Louis was pushed back. Judith was forced from power. Bernard withdrew. The emperor's household was shaken. But the revolt did not yet destroy him. The alliance against Louis proved unstable, and he recovered authority. The machinery of empire resumed. Outwardly, the crisis passed. Inwardly, something had changed. The sons had discovered that rebellion could pressure the emperor. Their supporters had discovered that the imperial center could be forced to retreat. The bishops had seen that moral language could be brought into the struggle. And Louis himself had learned that every settlement he made could become the beginning of another revolt. The court, after 830, must have felt different. Not openly ruined, not permanently broken. More dangerous than that. Functional, but suspicious. Men returned to halls where they had recently chosen sides. Clerics spoke of reconciliation while remembering who had stood where. The queen's allies watched the older princes. The princes watched at the queen's circle. The emperor tried to govern men who had already imagined disobedience. A repaired wall still shows the crack. Then came the greater crisis of 833. This time, the conflict drew in not only sons and aristocrats, but the highest religious authority of the Latin West. Pope Gregory IV became involved, traveling north during the confrontation between Louis and his rebellious sons. The details of his role and intentions are debated, and sources reflect the politics of their moment. But the symbolism alone was devastating. The emperor of the Christian West now faced a crisis in which his sons could present resistance as a defense of order, and religious authority could be invoked against the man who claimed to guard Christian unity. Louis was no longer fighting only ambition. He was fighting interpretation. Near Colmar, at a place later remembered as the Field of Lies, the emperor faced the forces aligned with his sons. The name itself carries the bitterness of memory. It suggests betrayal, desertion, the collapse of trust without the cleansing clarity of battle. The field did not need to become another Fontenoy. It became something more intimate. Louis's support melted away. Men who had come under his banner shifted allegiance or abandoned him. The emperor found himself not dramatically defeated by foreign swords, but politically emptied by the failure of loyalty. A ruler whose father had made Europe tremble was left exposed before his own children. Imagine a soldier in Louis's camp that day. Not a commander, not a chronicler, not a prince, just one armed man among many, standing beneath a grey sky with mud drying on his boots and the smell of horses thick around him. He has sworn loyalty, perhaps more than once in his life. He has heard bishops speak of obedience. He has heard nobles speak of rightful inheritance. He sees banners across the field. But the enemy does not look foreign. The enemy carries Carolingian blood. Then the signs begin. A lord moves, a group of men withdraws, a rumor passes. The soldier does not need to understand the legal arguments of 817 or the court politics of Judith's household. He understands something simpler and more frightening. The emperor's command no longer holds the men around him in place. That is how authority dies in public. Not always with a sword blow. Sometimes with men stepping away. The Field of Lies became a wound in the political imagination of the empire. Louis was taken into the power of his enemies. Lothar, the son elevated to protect imperial unity, now stood at the center of a movement that humiliated the emperor himself. The father had been overpowered by the family structure he had tried to organize, and the humiliation did not stop at military desertion. Louis was compelled into a public act of penance and degradation. At Soissons in 833, he was pressed to confess faults in a ritualized setting. The politics of this moment were brutal because they used the emperor's own religious ideals against him. Louis had embraced the moral seriousness of Christian rulership. He had accepted that kings could sin, that rulers could be corrected, that Christian order required humility before God. Now that humility was weaponized. A ruler who had made penance part of his authority found penance turned into an instrument of deposition. This was not merely a family victory over a father. It was an assault on imperial majesty. The bishops and political actors involved could frame the act as correction, even purification. But in practical terms, it taught the realm that the emperor could be stripped of dignity in the name of morality. The sacred language that strengthened Carolingian kingship under Charlemagne now became a blade sharp enough to cut Louis down. That was the danger of sacred power. It gives the ruler a divine vocabulary. It gives his enemies one too. For Lothar, the moment seemed to bring success. He had forced his father low. He had asserted his place. He had shown that imperial seniority could be made active through political pressure. But triumph over a father is not the same as stable rule. The treatment of Louis shocked enough people to weaken the coalition against him. Some nobles and bishops were uncomfortable with the extremity of his humiliation. Louis the German and Pepin did not necessarily wish to make Lothar overwhelmingly dominant. The alliance of sons, like many alliances built on shared opposition, began to fracture once victory raised the question of who benefited most. Here the empire revealed another cruel mechanism. The sons could unite against the father. They could not easily unite under one brother. By 834, Louis was restored to power. The restoration matters because it shows that Carolingian authority was not yet dead. Louis still had supporters. The moral revulsion against his treatment could be used in his favor. Lothar's overreach created fear among those who did not want to exchange one dominating father for one dominating brother. The emperor returned, but restoration is not the same as recovery. A man can be placed back on the throne while the throne itself has changed. After 834, Louis still ruled, but everyone had seen what could happen. His sons had rebelled, his followers had deserted. Bishops had judged, ritual had humiliated him. The aura of unchallengeable majesty had been broken in front of the political nation. The memory could not be erased. In a monastery, a scribe copying the account of these years would not simply be preserving scandal. He would be recording a new political possibility. The emperor could be opposed by sons. The emperor could be morally condemned. The emperor could be restored, yes, but restoration proved that deposition had been thinkable. That is the deeper consequence. Once a political order imagines the unthinkable, it can imagine it again. Louis spent the remaining years of his reign trying to manage the same impossible problem. Settlements shifted, sons reconciled and resisted. Charles still needed a future. Judith still worked to protect him. Lothar still carried imperial ambition. Louis the German still defended Eastern interests. Pepin of Aquitaine remained a key figure until his death in 838, after which Aquitaine itself became another arena of dispute. Every death reopened the map. Every reconciliation came with a shadow. Every promise had an audience waiting to judge whether it favored one branch too much. The emotional center of the story is painful because Louis was not simply inactive. He kept trying to govern. He kept trying to settle. He kept trying to hold a Christian empire together while being father to rival heirs. But the more he tried, the more each decision became proof to someone that he had chosen against them. This is why his reign cannot be reduced to weakness. Weakness alone does not explain the depth of the crisis. The crisis came from a system that forced paternal decisions to carry imperial consequences. To love one son politically was to endanger another. To preserve unity was to restrict inheritance. To provide inheritance was to weaken unity. To use bishops was to empower moral judgment. To accept penance was to expose majesty. To restore authority after humiliation was to rule over men who now knew the emperor could be humiliated. There was no clean path through it. By the late 830s, Louis still held the title, but the title had lost some of its power to command silence. His sons had become political adults. Their followers had tasted faction. Regions had learned to imagine futures under different Carolingian rulers. The empire's unity remained real enough to matter, but fragile enough to be fought over. The father had not yet died, but his inheritance was already at war with itself. In 840, Louis the Pious finally died. No one remained above the brothers. No father to revise the settlement. No living emperor whose authority could still serve as the last restraint. Only sons, claims, armies, memories of humiliation, and a title too grand for any one brother to surrender without a fight. The next stage would be bloodier, because when Louis died, the family conflict no longer needed to pretend it was correction. It became war. When Louis the Pious died in 840, the last restraint disappeared. For years, the empire had been cracking while the father still lived. His sons had rebelled, reconciled, sworn loyalty, broken loyalty, judged him, restored him, and waited. Every settlement had been temporary. Every promise had carried suspicion. Every act of forgiveness had left behind men who remembered the cost. But while Louis breathed, there was still a center. Damaged, yes. Humiliated, yes, but alive. After his death, the brothers no longer had to argue around the father. They could argue directly over the inheritance. And the inheritance was enormous. It was not only land, it was the imperial title. It was the memory of Charlemagne. It was Aachen, Italy, Aquitaine, Bavaria, the Frankish heartlands. The routes across the Rhine, the churches, the monasteries, the noble households, the oaths sworn by armed men, the right to speak as guardian of a Christian order that had already begun to fail its own language of unity. Lothar, the eldest, held the imperial dignity. In his mind, and in the logic of the settlement of 817, this dignity was not decorative. He was not meant to be merely one brother among others, wearing a better title. He was meant to stand above them. But Charles the Bald and Louis the German understood what that would mean. If Lothar's supremacy became real, their own kingdoms would become dependent, their followers less secure, their futures smaller. No prince surrounded by armed supporters can easily accept a future in which another brother has the right to overrule him. So the old Carolingian problem returned in its sharpest form. Was the empire one body with one imperial head? Or was it a family inheritance divided among sons who each had enough legitimacy to fight? The question had lived for years inside documents. Now it moved onto the battlefield. In 8-1, near Fontenoy-en-Puisaye, the grandsons of Charlemagne brought Frankish armies against Frankish armies. This was the horror that the Ordinatio had tried to prevent. The empire did not face a pagan revolt, or a Lombard king, or an Avar frontier, or a Muslim raid across a border. It faced itself. The field at Fontenoy was not simply a military encounter. It was a judgment on the entire Carolingian experiment. For decades, Charlemagne had trained the aristocracy to think of war as the instrument of order. War punished rebellion. War brought pagans to baptism. War defended Rome. War rewarded loyalty. War extended the reach of Christian kingship. Now that same warrior class turned inward. The men who had inherited the habits of conquest began using those habits to decide the future of the family. Imagine the morning before battle. A retainer tightens a strap on his shield. The leather is damp. The grass is wet around his boots. Somewhere nearby, horses breathe steam into the cold air. Priests move among men who are about to kill other Christians under related kings. A banner lifts in the wind, and across the field another banner answers it. Not foreign, not strange, not pagan, but Carolingian. The soldier may not understand every clause of the Ordinatio Imperii. He may not care which brother has the better legal claim, but he knows who feeds him. He knows whose household protects his family. He knows which lord gave him land, armor, or hope of advancement. He knows that if his prince loses, the world around him may be rearranged by men he does not trust. That is how dynastic conflict becomes everyone's war. Fontenoy was brutal. The exact numbers are uncertain, and medieval sources often turn grief into moral warning rather than statistical clarity. But the political consequence does not depend on a precise casualty count. The battle was remembered as devastating because it forced the Frankish elite to see the cost of their own division. Lothar was defeated by the alliance of Charles and Louis the German. But defeat did not end the problem. It clarified it. The imperial title could be beaten in battle. Lothar could call himself emperor, but the title alone could not compel his brothers to submit. The word still mattered. The dignity still mattered, but its practical force had been weakened by swords held in Frankish hands. A title that needs victory to prove itself is no longer unquestioned. For Charles and Louis, Fontenoy was a necessary victory. Without it, Lothar might have imposed a settlement on them. Their alliance was built from fear, calculation, and shared interest. Each needed the other because neither could safely face Lothar alone. Together, they could make imperial supremacy negotiable. But every victory inside a civil war carries a poison. It saves one future by damaging the world in which that future must live. The battle consumed men the Carolingian order needed. Warriors died who might have defended frontiers. Noble families lost sons who might have held counties, led local forces, or guarded roads. Trust among elites weakened. The memory of shared imperial service was stained by the fact that men had now fought under different Carolingian banners against their own political kin. The empire had not merely lost soldiers, it had lost innocence. After Fontenoy, the war did not immediately produce peace. Lothar remained dangerous. Charles and Louis needed to bind their alliance more firmly, not only before nobles, but before the soldiers whose obedience made their claims real. So, in 842, they met at Strasbourg. There, they swore oaths against Lothar. At first glance, the event seems less dramatic than Fontenoy. No battlefield mud, no mass of men breaking under attack, no bodies left in the grass. But Strasbourg may be even more revealing, because at Strasbourg the empire's fracture became audible. The oaths are famous because they were preserved by Nithard, a grandson of Charlemagne and an important source for these events. Charles and Louis did not simply swear in a distant formal language understood only by clerics and elites. The soldiers had to understand what their rulers were promising. So Louis spoke in a Romance form intelligible to Charles's men, and Charles spoke in a Germanic form intelligible to Louis's men. This was practical. That is exactly why it mattered. No one at Strasbourg was trying to stage the birth of France and Germany as modern nations. That would be too neat, too early, too false. But the moment revealed that the empire Charlemagne had ruled contained different speech communities, different regional followings, different political audiences. Unity could still be claimed from above, but obedience had to be explained below, in words men could actually understand. A monk copying the oaths might notice the strangeness immediately. His knife trims the parchment. His quill scratches the surface. Latin remains the language of church, learning, law, and memory. But here, in the record of high politics, other voices enter the page, not as rustic noise, as political necessity. The empire had begun to speak in pieces. That sentence must be handled carefully. The Carolingian world did not suddenly transform into modern Europe in one morning. West Francia was not yet France in the later sense. East Francia was not yet Germany. Lothar's Middle Kingdom was not yet the long corridor of later European conflicts. History does not leap so cleanly. But Strasbourg showed a direction. It showed that power was increasingly being mediated through regional realities that no imperial ceremony could erase. A ruler needed the loyalty of men who understood him not only as emperor, brother, or Christian prince, but as the lord of their own political world. Language did not cause the division by itself, but it revealed where political gravity was moving. For Charles, the western lands mattered. For Louis, the eastern lands mattered. For Lothar, the middle and the imperial title mattered. Each brother could claim to be Carolingian. Each could claim descent from Charlemagne. Each could invoke the Christian order. Yet each was now gathering power around a different territorial base. The family had become geography. This was the transformation that Charlemagne's system had never solved. As long as one ruler stood above all, regional differences could be managed through movement, command, and fear. Charlemagne could travel, punish, reward, and summon. His presence could temporarily make distance obey. His grandsons ruled in a different world. They inherited the distance without inheriting his ability to master it. Fontenoy showed that the imperial title could be resisted. Strasbourg showed that resistance needed its own language. Together, these moments made Verdun almost inevitable. Not inevitable in the sense that no human choice mattered. Choices mattered at every step. Lothar chose to press supremacy. Charles and Louis chose alliance. Nobles chose sides. Bishops justified positions. Soldiers followed their lords. But by 842, the old dream of simply restoring unity under one uncontested emperor had become less believable. Too much had happened. The father had been humiliated. The sons had rebelled. The brothers had fought. The armies had heard oaths in different tongues. The political imagination had changed. This is the quiet damage civil war does. It does not only kill people, it teaches survivors new possibilities. Men who once thought imperial unity was the natural order learn that another order can be negotiated. Nobles who once served the whole learn that serving a regional king may be safer. Clerics who once preached unity learn to bless compromise. Villages that once heard distant commands from an imperial center begin to experience rule through nearer powers. After Fontenoy and Strasbourg, peace required realism, and realism meant partition. Lothar still had to be accommodated because his defeat had not erased his rank. Charles and Louis had to be rewarded because they had won enough to refuse subordination. The aristocracy needed settlement because endless war threatened everyone's lands. The church needed peace because Christian empire looked obscene when its princes butchered one another. Ordinary people needed the fighting to stop because every elite quarrel eventually became food taken. Fields damaged, sons summoned, roads unsafe. By 843, the question was no longer whether Charlemagne's empire could return unchanged. It was how the brothers could divide it without admitting that division had become the new foundation of order. So the road led to Verdun. Not as a sudden betrayal, as a tired conclusion. The battlefield had spoken first. Then the oaths. Then the negotiators would come with maps, claims, rivers, cities, monasteries, and arguments over who received which portion of a world their grandfather had once made look indivisible. Fontenoy left mud and memory. Strasbourg left words. Verdun would leave borders. And after that, the empire of Charlemagne would still exist in name, in nostalgia, in law, in claims, in the ambitions of later rulers. But the political body that had once moved under one will would be gone. The brothers had not merely fought over inheritance. They had taught the empire how to become plural. Now all that remained was to make the fracture official. Verdun was not a battlefield. That is what makes it colder. No army charged through the streets. No city gate splintered under a ram. No emperor fell beneath a sword while banners burned above him. The violence had already happened elsewhere. At Fontenoy, in the rebellions, in the years of suspicion, in the slow destruction of trust between brothers who had inherited more than any family could peacefully divide. By 843, the blood had done its work. Now came the ink. The Treaty of Verdun did what battles alone could not do. It gave the fracture a legal form. It turned exhaustion into settlement, rivalry into geography, and family war into borders that later generations would stare at as if they had always been waiting inside the map. The empire of Charlemagne was divided among his three grandsons. Charles the Bald received the Western Kingdom. Louis the German received the Eastern Kingdom. Lothar received the Middle Kingdom, stretching from the North Sea down through lands tied to the Rhine and Burgundy into Italy, along with the imperial title. On paper, the arrangement preserved something. Lothar still held the dignity of emperor. The Carolingian family still ruled. The Christian language of order did not vanish. The treaty could be described as peace, and in the immediate sense, it was. Men were tired. Nobles needed security. Bishops needed the killing to stop. Fields needed to be worked. Roads needed to become roads again, not corridors of armed uncertainty. But peace came with a confession. The empire could not be kept whole. That was the meaning behind the settlement. For decades, Charlemagne's achievement had seemed to bend the world around one will. He had conquered Lombards, Saxons, Bavarians, and Avars. He had made Rome crown him with imperial memory. He had turned Aachen into a center of law, learning, ritual, and correction. He had forced distant peoples into a common order through war, church, administration, and personal authority. Yet his grandsons could not agree on what that common order meant once it became inheritance. The problem had never been only ambition. Ambition was everywhere, of course. Lothar wanted imperial supremacy to be real. Charles wanted a future not erased by his late birth. Louis the German wanted Eastern power secure from his brother's authority. Nobles wanted patrons who could reward them. Bishops wanted a ruler who could protect order without tearing Christian society apart. But beneath those ambitions lay a deeper contradiction. Charlemagne had built an empire with the tools of a personal kingdom. He raised the scale of power without fully changing the logic of inheritance. That contradiction had waited patiently beneath every triumph. It was there when Pepin divided his realm between Charles and Carloman. It was there when Carloman died, and Charles became sole ruler by fortune as much as design. It was there when Charlemagne's own sons died, leaving Louis the Pious to inherit the whole. It was there when Louis tried to write the future through the Ordinatio Imperii. It was there when Charles the Bold was born into a settlement that had no room for him. Verdun did not invent the crack. Verdun admitted it. Imagine a local official receiving news of the new settlement. He is not a prince. He is not a chronicler. He does not decide the fate of kingdoms. He sits in a hall that smells of smoke, damp wool, and old wood, while a messenger presents instructions under a valid seal. The same fields lie outside. The same church bell rings. The same peasants will bring grain. The same road still runs toward the next market town. And yet everything has changed. The oath must be adjusted. The name of the ruler has changed. The route of appeal has changed. A monastery that once looked toward one center may now look toward another. A noble family must calculate its loyalties again. A border that had been abstract to ordinary people begins to matter because armed men, tolls, obligations, and judgments will make it matter. That is how partition enters daily life. Not as a clean line on parchment, as a new demand, a new lord, a new uncertainty. For Charles the Bold, West Francia was not yet France in the modern sense. For Louis the German, East Francia was not yet Germany. Those later identities would take centuries of conflict, language, law, memory, and political transformation. But Verdun gave those future worlds a shape to grow inside. It pushed political gravity westward and eastward, while leaving Lothar's middle kingdom stretched like a long inheritance corridor between them. That middle kingdom was the most fragile part of the settlement. It carried prestige, Italy, and the imperial title, but geography made it difficult. Long, narrow, diverse, exposed, and politically complicated, it lacked the coherence that the Western and Eastern kingdoms could more easily develop over time. Lothar possessed the grandest title, but not the simplest realm. This was the irony of Verdun. The emperor received the hardest kingdom to hold. A title that once suggested universal authority was now attached to a portion. Impressive, sacred, but vulnerable. Lothar could still call himself emperor, but he could not command the whole inheritance. The word remained elevated. The reality beneath it had narrowed. The imperial idea survived. The imperial body did not. And the division did not stop with Verdun. In 855, after Lothar's death, the Treaty of Prüm divided his realm among his sons. In 870, the Treaty of Meissen divided much of Lotharingia between the eastern and western Carolingian kings. The middle that had been created to preserve imperial dignity became the zone later rulers repeatedly contested. A long belt of memory, ambition, and blood between emerging Western and Eastern powers. The map kept moving. Charlemagne's unity became less a government than a reference point. Something later kings, emperors, clerics, and chroniclers could invoke when they wanted to imagine a lost order. Aachen still stood. The chapel still held the echo of the old ruler. Manuscripts still preserved his reforms. Scholars would remember the learning of his court. Kings would claim descent, imitation, restoration, or inheritance. But the living structure that had once moved under Charlemagne's command had become something else. A family of kingdoms, related by blood, divided by interest, haunted by a unity they could praise more easily than rebuild. This is why the story should not end with a simple judgment against the heirs. It is tempting to say Charlemagne was great and his descendants ruined everything. That version is satisfying because it turns structural failure into moral decline. It gives the audience a hero, then a set of lesser men, then a fall. But history is rarely that generous. The heirs did not create the inheritance problem from nothing. They inherited it. They lived inside it. They made choices, and some of those choices deepened the disaster. But the design had been unstable long before Verdun. Charlemagne's brilliance had hidden the weakness because brilliance often does. A great ruler can make a fragile system look solid simply by standing at its center. Remove him, and the joints become visible. Louis the Pious was not merely a weak son. He was a ruler trying to make Christian unity coexist with dynastic expectation. Lothar was not merely arrogant. He was trying to make the imperial title mean what it claimed to mean. Charles was not merely disruptive. He was a legitimate son born into a future already distributed. Louis the German was not merely divisive, he was defending a regional base that would not accept being reduced to someone else's subordinate inheritance. Each man carried part of the truth. That was the tragedy. If only one had been wrong, the empire might have been easier to save, but several could be right at the same time and still destroy the whole. By the time Verdun was settled, Charlemagne had been dead for 29 years. That distance matters. The collapse was not immediate. The empire survived long enough to prove that it had real institutions, real memory, real loyalty, and real prestige. But it did not survive long enough to become something more durable than the family that held it. The founder had built upward faster than the structure could harden beneath him. The sword had moved faster than law. The crown had risen higher than succession could support. The church had blessed unity, but blessing could not prevent brothers from counting lands. The scribes could copy orders, but they could not make every armed noble prefer imperial abstraction over local security. The monks could preserve memory, but memory could not command obedience forever. And so the ending comes back to the image with which it began. A map on a table, parchment under candlelight, men arguing over rivers, cities, monasteries, roads, and rights. A world once gathered beneath one name, now divided into portions that could be governed, defended, inherited, and fought over again. No one in that room needed to say that Charlemagne had failed. In many ways, he had not. His empire reshaped Western Europe. His reforms changed learning, writing, royal ideology, church governance, and the imagination of Christian kingship. His name became a standard by which later rulers measured themselves. The idea of empire in the Latin West did not die with Verdun. It waited, transformed, and returned in other forms, other claims, other coronations. But the empire he built as a living political order could not survive its heirs. That is the final lesson. Not that conquest is meaningless, not that unity is impossible, not that great rulers leave nothing behind. The lesson is darker and more precise. A realm built around one extraordinary will must either become an institution stronger than the family, or it will eventually be dragged back into the family's quarrels. Charlemagne made kings kneel. He made frontiers move. He made Rome speak his name in the language of empire. But he could not make blood obey unity after he was gone. In Aachen, the stones remained. At Verdun, the map changed. And between those two images lies the whole tragedy of the Carolingian Empire. A dream powerful enough to shape Europe, but too personal, too divided, too human to remain whole. If you want the next chapter in this series, tell us which empire or dynasty should face the judgment of history next. Because history is not only the story of what rulers build, it is the autopsy of what their heirs cannot hold.